The air conditioning in the Maricopa County 911 dispatch center hummed its endless mechanical song as Vera Langford settled into her chair for another graveyard shift. The digital clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m., and outside the reinforced windows, Phoenix sprawled beneath her like a grid of amber lights stretching toward the dark mountains. Vera had been answering emergency calls for nearly 16 years, and in that time she had developed an instinct for reading fear in a caller's voice. There was the sharp, clean panic of a traffic accident, the hot rage of a domestic dispute turned violent, the confused desperation of someone watching a loved one have a heart attack. But when the call came through at 12:23 a.m. on that October night, she heard something in the caller's voice that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The voice belonged to a man who sounded young, maybe late 20s or early 30s, speaking in a breathless whisper that carried an edge of genuine terror. He identified himself as Caleb Drummond and said he was calling from somewhere in the desert northwest of Phoenix, though he couldn't provide an exact location. The man's breathing was ragged, and Vera could hear the crunch of gravel beneath his feet as he moved, suggesting he was walking or running while making the call. What disturbed Vera most was the specific nature of his fear. This wasn't someone who had been in a car accident or gotten lost while hiking. This was someone who believed he was being hunted. Caleb Drummond's story came out in fragments, interrupted by long pauses when he would stop speaking entirely, as if listening for sounds that Vera couldn't hear through the phone connection. He claimed he had been driving home from Prescott to Phoenix on Highway 60 when he had stopped to help what appeared to be a stranded motorist on a desolate stretch of road about 40 miles northwest of the city. The stranded vehicle had been a dark sedan with its hazard lights flashing, positioned on the shoulder near mile marker 127, and a figure had been standing beside it, waving for assistance. Drummond said he had pulled over because it was the right thing to do, because the desert at night could be deadly for someone stranded without water or working transportation. But when Drummond had approached the vehicle, he realized something was wrong. The sedan's engine was running, its headlights were on, and there was no visible damage or mechanical problem that would explain why someone would need roadside assistance. The figure who had been waving for help, a man wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, had not acted like someone grateful for assistance. Instead, the man had moved toward Drummond with a deliberate, purposeful stride that suggested aggression rather than relief. Drummond had noticed that the man's hands were concealed, possibly holding something, and his posture was that of someone preparing for confrontation rather than conversation. Drummond's survival instincts had kicked in immediately, honed by 2 tours in Afghanistan as an Army infantryman before his honorable discharge 3 years earlier. He had recognized the setup as an ambush, the kind of tactic used by insurgents to lure convoys into kill zones, and he had reacted with the speed and decisiveness that had kept him alive in Helmand Province. Without saying a word to the man approaching him, Drummond had turned and sprinted back to his truck, a 10-year-old Ford F-150 that he had left running with the keys in the ignition. He had thrown himself into the driver's seat and accelerated hard, his tires spitting gravel as he pulled back onto the highway, not bothering to close his door until he was already moving. Through his rearview mirror, Drummond had seen the man run back to the sedan and jump inside, and within seconds the vehicle had pulled onto the highway behind him, accelerating rapidly to close the distance. What had started as a potential robbery or carjacking had escalated into a high-speed pursuit through one of the most desolate stretches of Arizona desert, where cell phone coverage was spotty at best, and the nearest town was 20 miles in either direction. Drummond had pushed his truck to its limits, the engine roaring as he navigated the twisting highway at speeds approaching 90 miles per hour. But the sedan had stayed with him, sometimes pulling alongside as if trying to force him off the road. The pursuit had continued for nearly 15 minutes, with Drummond desperately searching for any sign of civilization or law enforcement presence. He had tried multiple times to call 911, but his phone had shown no signal for the first several attempts. The towers in this remote area too few and far between to provide consistent coverage. When he had finally gotten a signal and the call had connected to Vera's dispatch center, Drummond had veered off the highway onto a dirt access road that led into the open desert, hoping to lose his pursuer in the network of unmarked trails that crisscrossed the Bureau of Land Management property. Now, Drummond told Vera, he was somewhere in the desert, his truck abandoned about a mile back after it had become stuck in soft sand. He was on foot, hiding among the rock formations and desert vegetation, while somewhere behind him he could hear the sedan's engine as it searched the area. The man driving the sedan had not given up, had not returned to the highway, but was instead methodically working through the trails and washes, apparently determined to find Drummond, regardless of how long it took or how far into the desert the pursuit led. Vera's training and experience told her that this was not a typical call, not a stranded motorist or someone lost while hiking who needed directions back to civilization. This was a person in genuine danger, someone being actively hunted by an assailant who had gone to extraordinary lengths to trap and pursue them. She immediately began the process of locating Drummond's position using the cell phone ping data, coordinating with the technical team to triangulate his signal and provide responding officers with coordinates. At the same time, she kept Drummond on the line, her voice calm and professional as she gathered information and tried to keep him focused on survival rather than panic. The cell phone data came back with approximate coordinates that placed Drummond somewhere in the vast stretch of desert between Lake Pleasant Regional Park and the small town of Morristown, an area of several hundred square miles that consisted primarily of rugged terrain, sparse vegetation, and virtually no human habitation. The nearest law enforcement presence was a Department of Public Safety station in Wickenburg, about 30 miles northwest, and the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office substation in Surprise, about 25 miles southeast. Vera immediately dispatched units from both locations, knowing that even with lights and sirens, the responding officers would need at least 20 minutes to reach the general area where Drummond was hiding. Officer Darius Henshaw of the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office received the dispatch call while patrolling the northwestern suburbs of Phoenix, and he immediately acknowledged and began driving toward the coordinates Vera had provided. Henshaw was 34 years old and had been with the sheriff's office for 9 years, most of that time spent working the night shift in the remote areas where the Phoenix metropolitan area blurred into open desert. He was familiar with the terrain where Drummond was supposedly hiding, having responded to numerous calls in that area over the years, mostly involving off-road vehicle accidents, illegal dumping, or migrants who had gotten separated from their groups while crossing the border. As Henshaw drove northwest on Highway 60, his patrol vehicle's engine straining as he maintained speeds well above the posted limit, he maintained radio contact with Vera, who was still on the phone with Drummond. The situation was evolving rapidly, with Drummond reporting that he could hear the sedan getting closer, its engine echoing off the rock formations as it worked through the maze of trails. Drummond had found a defensive position among a cluster of large boulders, where he had a clear view of the approaches and could potentially defend himself if the confrontation became physical. He had told Vera that he was unarmed, having left his pistol in his truck when he abandoned it, but he had found a heavy rock that he could use as a weapon if necessary. Vera could hear the stress in Drummond's voice escalating as the sounds of the pursuing vehicle grew louder and more distinct. He described seeing headlights sweeping across the desert about 200 yards from his position, methodically searching the area with the patience and thoroughness of someone who knew their quarry was nearby and had nowhere to go. The driver was not rushing, was not acting impulsively, but was instead conducting a systematic search that suggested military or law enforcement training, someone who understood how to track and corner prey in open terrain. Henshaw was still 15 minutes out when Drummond's situation deteriorated further. The sedan had apparently found Drummond's abandoned truck and had stopped beside it, the driver getting out to examine the vehicle. Drummond watched from his hiding place as the figure, still too far away to identify clearly in the darkness, spent several minutes searching through the truck's cab, apparently looking for identification or clues about who had been driving it. The figure then did something that chilled both Drummond and Vera when he described it over the phone. The man pulled out a flashlight and began walking in a slow circle around the abandoned truck, studying the ground carefully, apparently tracking Drummond's footprints in the soft desert sand. The realization that his pursuer was tracking him on foot, following his trail like a hunter following wounded game, pushed Drummond past controlled fear into something approaching panic. His voice became higher and tighter as he whispered into the phone, describing how the flashlight beam was getting closer, methodically following the path he had taken from his truck to his current hiding place. Vera tried to keep him calm, assuring him that help was on the way, that Officer Henshaw would reach his location within minutes. But she could hear the terror in Drummond's breathing as the flashlight beam swept closer and closer to the rocks where he was concealed. Henshaw pushed his patrol vehicle harder, the suspension straining as he left the paved highway and began navigating the network of dirt roads that led into the desert. His GPS showed Drummond's last known position as approximately 3 miles ahead, but the terrain was rough and the roads were unmarked, forcing him to slow down to avoid becoming stuck or damaging his vehicle in a way that would leave him unable to respond effectively. He called out his position over the radio every few minutes, providing updates to dispatch and requesting additional units as backup, knowing that he might be walking into a dangerous situation where he would be outnumbered or outgunned. Back in the dispatch center, Vera continued talking to Drummond, her voice the only connection he had to safety and civilization as he crouched among the rocks, watching the flashlight beam sweep closer. She had pulled up maps of the area on her computer screens, trying to identify landmarks or features that might help Henshaw locate Drummond more quickly once he reached the general area. She had also contacted the Department of Public Safety helicopter unit based in Phoenix, requesting aerial support, but was told that the helicopter was currently committed to a pursuit on the east side of the valley and would not be available for at least 45 minutes. The critical moment came when Drummond suddenly stopped responding to Vera's questions, his voice cutting off mid-sentence. She could still hear the connection was active, could hear the sound of breathing and the faint scrape of fabric against rock, but Drummond had gone completely silent. Several long seconds passed, seconds that felt like hours, as Vera stared at her computer screen and willed Henshaw to drive faster, to somehow cover the remaining distance in impossible time. Then she heard something through the phone connection that made her blood run cold. A voice that was not Drummond's, a calm, measured voice that said just 3 words that would haunt her for years to come. "Found you, Caleb." The phone went dead, the connection terminating abruptly, leaving Vera staring at her screen and frantically trying to redial Drummond's number. The call went straight to voicemail, suggesting the phone had been turned off or destroyed. She immediately radioed Henshaw with an urgent update, informing him that Drummond's pursuer had apparently found him and that the situation had escalated to an active confrontation. Henshaw acknowledged and pushed his vehicle even harder, abandoning any pretense of caution as he raced toward the coordinates where Drummond had made his last call. Henshaw reached the general area approximately 8 minutes after Drummond's phone went dead, his headlights illuminating the empty desert as he searched for any sign of vehicles or human activity. He followed the rough trail for about a mile until his lights picked up the shape of a dark sedan parked near a cluster of large boulders, its engine running and driver's door standing open. Approximately 30 yards beyond the sedan, Henshaw could see another vehicle, the Ford F-150 that Drummond had been driving, sitting at an angle in soft sand where it had become stuck. Henshaw parked his patrol vehicle at a tactical distance from the two civilian vehicles, positioning it to provide cover if needed and to keep his lights illuminating the scene. He radioed his position and the vehicle descriptions to dispatch, then drew his service weapon and began approaching on foot, moving carefully and using the available cover provided by desert vegetation and rock formations. The scene was eerily quiet, with no sounds of struggle or voices, just the steady rumble of the sedan's engine and the whisper of wind moving through the creosote bushes. As Henshaw moved closer to the sedan, his flashlight beam swept across the interior, revealing that it was empty, with no personal belongings visible and no registration or insurance documents in the usual places. The vehicle appeared to be a rental, or possibly stolen, with temporary tags and none of the accumulated clutter that typically filled a car that someone actually lived with and used daily. Henshaw noted these details, his training and experience telling him that this was a vehicle being used for a specific purpose, not someone's personal transportation. Beyond the sedan, Henshaw could see Drummond's truck more clearly, and he noticed that the driver's door was open and the interior light was on, casting a weak glow across the surrounding sand. As he approached the truck, Henshaw saw something that made him stop and bring his weapon up to a ready position. There were footprints in the sand around the truck, multiple sets, suggesting at least two people had been moving around the vehicle. More disturbing were the drag marks leading away from the truck, parallel lines in the sand that suggested something heavy had been pulled across the ground toward the rock formations where Drummond had said he was hiding. Henshaw followed the drag marks with his flashlight beam, his pulse quickening as he realized what he might be about to discover. The marks led to the cluster of large boulders about 50 yards from the truck, disappearing into shadows that his flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. He radioed for backup to expedite their response, informing dispatch that he had located the vehicles and was investigating a possible crime scene, then began moving toward the rocks, every sense alert for any sign of ambush or danger. What Officer Henshaw found when he reached the boulder cluster would launch one of the most intensive investigations in Maricopa County Sheriff's Office history, an investigation that would reveal a pattern of violence stretching back years and crossing multiple state lines. Among the rocks, illuminated by his flashlight beam, Henshaw discovered Caleb Drummond's cell phone, its screen shattered, but the device still attempting to power on. Near the phone was a large pool of blood, still wet and glistening in the flashlight beam, and clear signs of a violent struggle. Rocks had been disturbed, desert vegetation had been trampled, and there were more drag marks leading away from the scene, heading deeper into the desert where Henshaw's flashlight beam couldn't reach. But Caleb Drummond himself was gone, vanished into the vast darkness of the Arizona desert, along with whoever had been hunting him. Officer Darius Henshaw stood in the cold desert night, his flashlight beam tracing the blood trail that led away from the boulder cluster and disappeared into the darkness beyond. His radio crackled with updates from dispatch as additional units began converging on his location. But Henshaw knew that every minute that passed reduced the chances of finding Caleb Drummond alive. The amount of blood pooled among the rocks suggested serious injury, possibly life-threatening, and the drag marks indicated that Drummond had either been unconscious or unable to resist as he was pulled away from his defensive position. Henshaw's training told him to secure the scene and wait for backup, but his instincts as a law enforcement officer who had sworn to protect and serve told him that waiting might mean the difference between rescue and recovery. Henshaw made the tactical decision to follow the blood trail, radioing his intentions to dispatch and requesting that responding units establish a perimeter around the area while he attempted to track the suspect and victim. Vera Langford, still coordinating the response from the dispatch center, felt her stomach tighten as she listened to Henshaw's transmissions. She had been on the phone with Drummond just minutes before his capture, had heard the fear in his voice as he described being hunted through the desert, and now she was listening to the aftermath of whatever violence had occurred after that terrible moment when the unknown voice had said, "Found you, Caleb," and the phone had gone dead. The blood trail led Henshaw deeper into the desert, away from the vehicles and the rough access road, following a course that seemed to have been chosen deliberately to avoid easy pursuit. Whoever had taken Drummond knew this terrain, understood how to move through it without leaving obvious tracks except for the unavoidable blood trail that marked their passage. Henshaw followed carefully, his weapon drawn and his senses alert for any sign of ambush, knowing that he might be walking into a trap set by someone who had already demonstrated sophisticated tactical thinking and a willingness to use extreme violence. After following the trail for approximately 300 yards, Henshaw discovered something that made the situation even more disturbing. The blood trail led to a second vehicle, a white panel van that had been parked in a wash about a quarter mile from where the sedan and Drummond's truck sat. The van was older, probably from the mid-2000s, with no windows in the cargo area and Arizona plates that Henshaw immediately called in for registration check. The rear doors of the van stood open, and Henshaw's flashlight revealed a cargo area that had been modified with restraints, soundproofing material, and other equipment that suggested this vehicle had been specifically prepared for kidnapping and transporting victims. Henshaw felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air as he examined the van's interior. This was not a spontaneous crime, not a carjacking or robbery gone wrong. This was a planned abduction carried out by someone who had invested significant time and resources into preparing for it. The sedan that had initially pursued Drummond had been a lure, a way to force him off the highway and into the desert where the real capture could take place, away from witnesses and surveillance. The white van was the transport vehicle, positioned in advance at a location where it could be loaded quickly and driven away on routes that would avoid main roads and traffic cameras. The registration check came back showing that the van was registered to a rental company in Tucson, about 2 hours south of Phoenix. Dispatch contacted the rental company's emergency line and learned that the van had been rented 3 days earlier by a man using identification and a credit card that the rental agent had verified at the time, but now appeared to be fraudulent. The rental agreement showed an address in Mesa that turned out to be a vacant lot, and the phone number provided went to a disconnected line. Whoever had rented the van had used a sophisticated false identity, complete with apparently valid documents that would pass casual inspection. But the van was empty, its engine cold, suggesting that it had been sitting in this location for some time. Henshaw expanded his search pattern, looking for any sign of where the suspect might have taken Drummond after reaching the van. He found tire tracks leading out of the wash and onto a rough trail that headed northwest, deeper into the Bureau of Land Management territory where dozens of unmarked tracks crisscrossed the landscape. The suspect had taken Drummond in a different vehicle, leaving both the sedan and the van behind, presumably because he knew they could be traced and wanted to switch to a clean vehicle before continuing to whatever destination he had planned. Additional sheriff's office units began arriving at the scene, along with a Department of Public Safety helicopter that had finally become available after completing its previous assignment. The helicopter's thermal imaging equipment was deployed to search the surrounding desert for any sign of Drummond or his abductor, while ground units began processing the 3 abandoned vehicles for evidence. Crime scene technicians documented the blood evidence, collected samples for DNA analysis, and began the meticulous process of searching for fingerprints, trace evidence, and any clue that might identify the person responsible for Drummond's abduction. Back at the dispatch center, Vera Langford had been relieved from her position on the radio by a supervisor, but she remained at her console, unable to leave while the search for Caleb Drummond continued. She had replayed the recorded 911 call multiple times, listening for any background sounds or details that might provide clues about the abductor's identity or intentions. The voice that had said, "Found you, Caleb," haunted her, its calm, almost professional tone suggesting someone who was comfortable with violence and completely in control of the situation. Detective Sarah Kovacs of the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene just after 3 o'clock a.m., having been called in from home to lead the investigation. Kovacs was a 15-year veteran of the Sheriff's Office with extensive experience in violent crimes and missing persons cases, and she immediately recognized that this case had characteristics that set it apart from typical abductions. The level of planning, the use of multiple vehicles, the careful selection of a remote location, and the apparent tracking skills demonstrated by the abductor all suggested someone with specialized training and experience, possibly military or law enforcement background. Kovacs established a command post near the vehicle cluster and began coordinating the various elements of the investigation. She had Officer Henshaw walk her through his response and the evidence he had discovered, taking detailed notes and asking questions that helped her develop an initial profile of the suspect. The use of the sedan as a lure vehicle, the positioning of the van as a secondary transport, and the apparent escape in a third vehicle that all indicated sophisticated operational planning that went beyond what typical criminals employed. This was someone who thought strategically, who anticipated law enforcement response, and who had prepared multiple contingencies to avoid capture. The helicopter's thermal imaging sweep of the surrounding desert proved fruitless, showing no heat signatures that might indicate a person or vehicle in the immediate area. The suspect had apparently moved quickly after loading Drummond into whatever vehicle he had used for the final stage of the abduction, getting far enough away that the helicopter's sensors could not detect him within the search parameters. Kovacs expanded the search area and requested additional helicopters and search teams, but she knew that with every passing hour, the suspect could be getting farther away, potentially crossing into another county or even another state. As dawn began to break over the desert, painting the rock formations in shades of orange and pink, crime scene technicians made several discoveries that would prove crucial to the investigation. Inside the white van, hidden beneath the soundproofing material, they found a small notebook containing handwritten notes and observations. The notebook appeared to be a surveillance log, documenting Caleb Drummond's movements and routines over a period of several weeks. The entries showed that someone had been watching Drummond's home in Phoenix, had followed him to work, and had noted his habits, including his weekly trips to visit friends in Prescott. The level of detail in the surveillance log was chilling, showing that the abductor had invested significant time in learning everything about Drummond's life. The notebook included notes about what time Drummond typically left for work, what route he took, where he stopped for coffee, and even personal details about his relationships and daily activities. Most disturbing were several entries that discussed potential locations for acquisition, with the remote stretch of Highway 60 ultimately selected as the optimal site based on factors including low traffic volume, limited cell phone coverage, and easy access to the desert where a pursuit could be conducted away from witnesses. Detective Kovacs photographed every page of the notebook and immediately began working to understand why Caleb Drummond had been targeted for what appeared to be a carefully planned abduction. She contacted Drummond's emergency contacts, provided by Vera, from the information he had given during the 911 call, and learned that he was a 29-year-old military veteran who worked as the equipment operator for a construction company. He lived alone in a modest apartment in Phoenix, had no known enemies, and according to friends and co-workers was a quiet, responsible person who kept mostly to himself since returning from military service. The military connection immediately caught Kovacs' attention, and she requested Drummond's service records through official channels. While waiting for that information, she contacted the FBI's Phoenix field office to request assistance, recognizing that this case might involve interstate activity and possibly federal crimes, including kidnapping and use of interstate commerce to facilitate violent felonies. The FBI agent who responded to the scene was Special Agent Marcus Bellamy, a specialist in violent crimes who had worked numerous kidnapping cases throughout the Southwest. Bellamy reviewed the evidence that had been collected and immediately recognized patterns that concerned him. The sophisticated surveillance, the use of multiple vehicles and false identities, and the careful selection of the abduction location all suggested that this might not be an isolated incident. Bellamy had worked cases involving professional criminals who specialized in targeted abductions, sometimes for ransom, but more often for purposes related to organized crime, human trafficking, or personal vendettas. He suggested that Kovacs expand the investigation to look for similar unsolved cases in Arizona and surrounding states. Cases involving military veterans who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. While Bellamy coordinated with his FBI colleagues to search federal databases for similar cases, Kovacs focused on the physical evidence from the scene. The blood evidence was being processed on a priority basis, with preliminary results expected within hours rather than the usual days or weeks. The amount of blood found at the boulder cluster suggested that Drummond had sustained a significant injury, but medical examiners consulting on the case believed it was not immediately fatal. The blood pattern and volume were consistent with a head wound or severe laceration rather than a gunshot or stabbing to vital organs, meaning there was still hope that Drummond might be alive. The sedan used in the initial pursuit was registered to a rental company at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, rented 2 days before the abduction using yet another false identity. Surveillance footage from the airport rental counter showed a man in his 40s wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, his features deliberately obscured in a way that made positive identification difficult. The man had paid cash for the rental and had provided documents that appeared legitimate at the time, but were later determined to be high-quality forgeries. As the investigation expanded, a pattern began to emerge that troubled both Kovacs and Bellamy. Over the past 18 months, 3 other military veterans in Arizona had disappeared under circumstances that shared similarities with Drummond's abduction. 2 of the men had been found deceased in remote desert locations, their bodies showing signs of having been held captive and subjected to violence before death. The 3rd man had never been found, with his disappearance remaining an open missing persons case. All 3 victims had been in their late 20s or early 30s. All had served in combat zones, and all had disappeared after being lured or forced into isolated desert locations. The FBI database search revealed additional cases in Nevada, New Mexico, and California that fit similar patterns. Over the past 5 years, at least 11 military veterans had been abducted, held captive, and in most cases eventually murdered in remote locations throughout the Southwest. The cases had been investigated by different agencies and had never been connected because they occurred across multiple jurisdictions, and the methods used varied slightly in each case. But when analyzed as a potential series, the pattern became clear. Someone was systematically targeting military veterans, specifically those who had served in combat roles, and was abducting them for purposes that remained unclear, but appeared to involve extended captivity and violence. Special Agent Bellamy immediately elevated the case to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico, requesting a profile of the suspect based on the accumulated evidence from multiple cases. While waiting for that analysis, the investigation team in Arizona focused on the immediate priority of locating Caleb Drummond before he became another murder victim. The timeline was critical, as previous cases suggested that victims were typically held captive for between 48 and 96 hours before being killed, giving the investigation perhaps 2 to 3 days to find Drummond alive. Officer Darius Henshaw, who had discovered the initial crime scene and had been the first responder to Vera Langford's desperate dispatch, found himself unable to leave the case despite having completed his regular shift hours ago. He had heard Drummond's voice over the radio during the pursuit, had followed the blood trail and discovered the van, and felt a personal connection to the victim that went beyond professional duty. Henshaw requested and received permission to join the investigation team, bringing his knowledge of the remote desert areas and his experience with search and rescue operations. As the morning sun climbed higher and the desert heat began to build, Detective Kovacs assembled a task force that included Sheriff's Office investigators, FBI agents, Department of Public Safety officers, and specialized search and rescue teams. The task force established a command center at the Sheriff's Office substation in Surprise, where they could coordinate the multiple elements of the investigation and maintain communication with the various teams deployed across the vast desert landscape. Large maps of Maricopa County covered the walls, marked with the locations of previous abductions, body recovery sites, and potential areas where a suspect might hold victims. Vera Langford was interviewed extensively about her conversation with Drummond, providing details about his emotional state, the background sounds she had heard, and the exact wording of the final moments before his capture. Audio forensics specialists analyzed the recording of the 911 call, isolating and enhancing background sounds that might provide clues about the location or the suspect's identity. They identified the sound of a specific type of engine, possibly a diesel truck or heavy equipment, that had been faintly audible at one point during the call, suggesting there might be industrial or mining activity in the area where Drummond had been hiding. The breakthrough in determining Drummond's possible location came from an unexpected source. A geologist consulting with the sheriff's office on an unrelated case mentioned that the rock formations described by Henshaw matched the characteristics of an area about 15 miles northwest of where the vehicles had been found, near an abandoned copper mine that had ceased operations in the 1970s. The mine property included several structures that might be suitable for holding a captive, and the remote location made it unlikely that anyone would stumble upon criminal activity there. More significantly, the property had been purchased 3 years earlier by a shell corporation whose ownership was obscured through multiple layers of legal entities. Detective Kovacs immediately redirected resources toward investigating the abandoned mine property and tracing the ownership of the shell corporation. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit began the complex process of untangling the corporate structure, looking for any connection to individuals who might match the profile developing for their suspect. Meanwhile, the sheriff's office deployed surveillance teams to observe the mine property from a distance, looking for any sign of activity or vehicles that might indicate the location was being used for the kidnappings. The surveillance teams reported that the mine property appeared abandoned, with no visible activity and no vehicles present. However, aerial reconnaissance revealed that one of the old mining buildings had a roof in surprisingly good condition compared to the other deteriorating structures, and thermal imaging suggested there might be heat sources inside the building despite its apparently abandoned state. This discrepancy was enough to convince Kovacs and Bellamy that the location warranted further investigation, but they needed to approach carefully to avoid alerting the suspect if he was indeed using the property to hold Drummond captive. As the task force prepared to move on the mine property, now approximately 16 hours after Drummond's initial 911 call to Vera Langford, the investigation received information that would dramatically change their understanding of the case and reveal the true horror of what had been happening in the Arizona desert for years. The FBI's financial investigation into the shell corporation that owned the abandoned mine property traced through 3 layers of limited liability companies before connecting to a name that made Special Agent Bellamy's blood run cold. The ultimate beneficial owner was a man named Gerald Voss, a former Army interrogator who had been dishonorably discharged 8 years earlier following allegations of unauthorized interrogation techniques used on detainees in Iraq. Voss had been court-martialed for conduct unbecoming an officer and for violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice related to prisoner abuse, but the details of his case had been sealed due to national security concerns. After his discharge, Voss had disappeared from public records, using various aliases and shell corporations to obscure his activities and location. Detective Kovacs immediately pulled Voss's military service record and discovered a disturbing history that helped explain the pattern of veteran abductions. Voss had served as an intelligence officer specializing in interrogation and psychological operations, working primarily in Iraq during the surge years when interrogation techniques were a subject of intense controversy and oversight. According to his service record, Voss had been exceptionally skilled at his work, extracting valuable intelligence from high-value targets through methods that pushed the boundaries of what was legally and ethically acceptable. But colleagues who had worked with him reported concerns about his psychological state, noting that he seemed to derive satisfaction from the power he held over detainees and showed concerning signs of sadism masked as professional dedication. The allegations that led to Voss's court-martial involved an incident where he had allegedly held a detainee beyond authorized timeframes and had used interrogation methods that exceeded approved parameters, resulting in severe psychological trauma to the detainee. During the investigation, military psychologists who evaluated Voss concluded that he exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder and sadistic personality features, finding satisfaction in the suffering of others and viewing human beings as objects to be manipulated rather than individuals deserving of dignity and rights. The recommendation had been for Voss to receive psychiatric treatment and to be barred from any position involving authority over vulnerable individuals. But after his discharge, he had simply vanished into civilian life where no one monitored his activities or ensured he received treatment. Special Agent Bellamy contacted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and shared Voss's background with the profilers who had been working on the series of veteran abductions. The profile that emerged was terrifying in its clarity and implications. Voss appeared to be acting out a twisted recreation of his interrogation work, abducting veterans who reminded him of his former role and subjecting them to the same techniques he had once used professionally, but now without the constraints of military oversight or rules of engagement. The profilers believed that Voss viewed himself as still conducting military operations, selecting targets based on their combat experience, and treating the abductions as a form of continued service, twisted through the lens of his psychological pathology. The timeline became even more urgent when the BAU profile suggested that Voss's pattern involved escalating violence over the period he held his victims. Based on evidence from previous cases, victims were initially subjected to interrogation-style psychological manipulation, then physical deprivation and abuse, before finally being killed, when Voss either grew bored or believed he had extracted whatever information or satisfaction he sought from the experience. The typical captivity period ranged from 48 to 96 hours, meaning that Caleb Drummond, now approximately 18 hours into his captivity, potentially had between 30 and 78 hours before Voss would kill him. Detective Kovacs assembled a tactical response team consisting of FBI hostage rescue team members, Maricopa County Sheriff's Office SWAT operators, and specialized personnel trained in high-risk warrant service and hostage rescue. The operation would be conducted at the abandoned mine property, based on the evidence suggesting Voss was using one of the old mining buildings as his holding facility. The tactical plan called for a coordinated approach using multiple entry teams, aerial support from the helicopter equipped with thermal imaging, and perimeter containment to prevent Voss from escaping if he detected the approaching teams. Officer Darius Henshaw was assigned to the outer perimeter team, responsible for blocking potential escape routes and preventing Voss from fleeing into the surrounding desert. Although Henshaw wanted to be part of the entry team that would directly rescue Drummond, he understood that the FBI hostage rescue team had specialized training and equipment for such operations, and that the best way he could contribute was to ensure Voss had no avenue of escape once the operation began. Henshaw positioned himself along a rough trail that provided vehicle access to the mine property from the northwest, a route that surveillance suggested might be Voss's primary entrance and exit point. As the tactical teams staged several miles from the target location, Conducting final equipment checks and reviewing the operational plan, Vera Langford sat in the dispatch center watching the operation unfold on computer screens linked to the command post. She had been relieved from active duty hours ago, but had refused to go home, feeling a personal connection to Caleb Drummond after spending those terrifying minutes on the phone with him as he was hunted through the desert. Vera watched the small icons representing each tactical element move across the digital map, converging on the abandoned mine property, and she found herself silently praying for Drummond's survival and for the safety of the officers moving into what could become a deadly confrontation. The tactical approach began at 2:17 p.m., exactly 38 hours after Drummond's initial 911 call. The teams moved in coordinated silence, using natural terrain features and the deteriorating mining structures as cover while they converged on the building that thermal imaging had identified as potentially occupied. The building was a large metal structure that had once served as an equipment maintenance facility, its exterior showing decades of weathering and neglect, but its roof and walls still largely intact. The thermal imaging showed heat signatures inside the building, consistent with at least one person and possibly mechanical equipment such as a generator providing power to the otherwise abandoned structure. Special Agent Bellamy led one of the entry teams, coordinating with Detective Kovacs, who was positioned at the Tactical Operations Center about a mile from the target building. The plan called for simultaneous breaches at 3 points, overwhelming any defenses Voss might have prepared and giving him no time to harm his hostage before the teams could secure him. The FBI's negotiator was standing by with communications equipment, prepared to attempt dialogue with Voss if he detected the approach and barricaded himself with Drummond as a hostage. But the preference was for a rapid, decisive entry that would give Voss no opportunity to react. As the entry teams reached their final positions, preparing for the coordinated breach, Officer Henshaw observed a development that would prove crucial to the operation's success. A vehicle approached along the northwest trail, a dark blue pickup truck moving at moderate speed toward the mine property. Henshaw immediately radioed the observation to the Tactical Operations Center, providing a description of the vehicle and its direction of travel. Detective Kovacs made the rapid decision to intercept the vehicle before it could reach the mine buildings, recognizing that if this was Voss returning to the property, they could potentially capture him away from wherever he was holding Drummond, eliminating the risk of a hostage situation. Henshaw was authorized to conduct a high-risk traffic stop, positioning his patrol vehicle to block the trail and coordinating with 2 other perimeter units that rapidly converged on his location. As the dark blue pickup truck came around a bend in the trail and saw Henshaw's patrol vehicle blocking the path ahead, the driver immediately recognized the law enforcement presence and attempted to reverse direction. But the terrain and the narrow trail made rapid maneuvering difficult, and within seconds the other perimeter units had blocked the retreat route, trapping the pickup truck between multiple police vehicles with nowhere to go. The driver of the pickup truck was indeed Gerald Voss, a 46-year-old man with military bearing despite years removed from service, wearing outdoor clothing and sunglasses that gave him the appearance of someone engaged in legitimate recreational activity in the desert. Voss initially attempted to maintain a facade of innocent confusion, asking what the problem was and claiming he was simply exploring old mining properties as a hobby. But when officers approached his vehicle with weapons drawn and ordered him to exit with his hands visible, Voss's demeanor changed dramatically. His expression shifted from feigned confusion to cold calculation, as he assessed the situation and apparently recognized that he was surrounded and had no viable escape route. The arrest of Gerald Voss was conducted with extreme caution, with officers treating him as an armed and highly dangerous suspect despite his outward compliance. Voss was ordered to lie prone on the ground and was handcuffed using techniques designed to prevent escape or violent resistance. A search of his person revealed no weapons, but officers found a small notebook similar to the surveillance log discovered in the white van, containing entries that appeared to document his activities with Caleb Drummond over the past hours. The entries were clinical and detached, describing interrogation techniques applied and psychological responses observed, written in the professional jargon of military intelligence reports as if Voss was still conducting official operations rather than committing brutal crimes. With Voss in custody and unable to warn any potential accomplices or trigger any contingency plans he might have prepared, Detective Kovacs authorized the entry teams to breach the metal building at the mine property. The three teams moved simultaneously, using explosive breaching charges to blow open locked doors and create multiple entry points. The coordinated breach was executed with precision, with FBI hostage rescue team members flooding into the building from 3 directions, their weapons and flashlights sweeping the interior as they searched for Drummond and cleared potential threats. What the entry teams found inside the metal building would provide crucial evidence for the prosecution of Gerald Voss, while simultaneously revealing the full horror of what he had been doing to his victims. The interior of the building had been extensively modified, transformed from an abandoned equipment maintenance facility into what could only be described as a torture chamber disguised as a military interrogation facility. One section of the building contained a makeshift cell with reinforced walls and a heavy door designed to hold captives securely while preventing their screams from being heard outside. Another section had been set up as an interrogation room, complete with a metal chair bolted to the floor, bright lights positioned to disorient and exhaust subjects, and audio equipment for recording sessions. The entry team found Caleb Drummond in the cell, alive but in severe distress. He had been restrained with military-style zip ties, had sustained injuries consistent with physical assault, and showed signs of sleep deprivation and psychological trauma. Medical personnel who rushed into the building immediately after it was secured determined that Drummond's injuries, while serious, were not life-threatening. The head wound that had produced the blood trail at the initial capture site had been treated with basic first aid, suggesting that Voss wanted to keep his victims alive and conscious for extended periods, rather than allowing them to die quickly from their injuries. Drummond was carefully extracted from the building and transported by helicopter to a trauma center in Phoenix, where he would receive comprehensive medical treatment and begin the long process of psychological recovery. Before being sedated for transport, Drummond managed to communicate with Officer Henshaw, who had arrived at the building shortly after the successful breach. Drummond recognized Henshaw's voice from the radio traffic during the rescue operation and specifically asked to thank the dispatcher who had stayed on the phone with him during his desperate flight through the desert. Henshaw promised to convey Drummond's gratitude to Vera Langford, whose calm professionalism and determination to help him had provided his only connection to hope during those terrifying minutes. The forensic processing of Voss's torture facility would take days, and would ultimately provide evidence linking him to at least 11 murders across 5 states. Investigators found meticulously organized files containing photographs, audio recordings, and written documentation of each victim's captivity and the interrogation techniques Voss had employed. The files were organized with military precision. Each victim assigned a case number and dossier that included background information Voss had gathered during his surveillance phase, notes on interrogation sessions, and his clinical observations about each victim's psychological breaking point. The level of documentation suggested that Voss viewed himself as conducting legitimate research or operations, maintaining records with the same attention to detail he would have applied to authorized military intelligence work. Most disturbing were the audio recordings, which captured Voss's voice conducting interrogations that served no purpose except to satisfy his sadistic desires. The recordings showed that Voss would question his victims about their military service, their combat experiences, and their psychological vulnerabilities, then would use that information to construct scenarios designed to maximize their fear and helplessness. He would sometimes pretend to be conducting official military business, claiming that his victims were being detained as part of legitimate national security operations, using his knowledge of military procedures to make the deception more believable and to exploit his victim's training to obey orders and cooperate with superior officers. Detective Kovacs and Special Agent Bellamy conducted the initial interrogation of Gerald Voss at the FBI's Phoenix field office, with Voss having been advised of his rights and provided with legal counsel. Voss initially refused to speak without his attorney present, but his attorney, after reviewing the overwhelming evidence that had been collected, advised him that cooperation might be his only opportunity to avoid the death penalty that federal prosecutors were certain to seek. Voss eventually agreed to provide a statement, though his words would provide little comfort to the families of his victims and would reveal a mind so twisted by pathology that rehabilitation seemed impossible. In his statement, Voss claimed that he had been conducting important psychological research that would benefit military interrogation training and national security. He argued that his victims had volunteered for service in the military and therefore had accepted the risk of being used for training purposes, a rationalization so disconnected from reality that even his own attorney appeared disturbed by the explanation. Voss showed no remorse for his actions, instead expressing frustration that his work had been interrupted before he could complete what he described as a comprehensive study of psychological breaking points under various interrogation scenarios. Psychological evaluations conducted on Voss confirmed what his military service record had suggested years earlier. He suffered from severe antisocial personality disorder with sadistic features, combined with delusional beliefs about the legitimacy of his activities and a complete inability to empathize with the suffering he inflicted on others. The forensic psychiatrists concluded that Voss was mentally competent to stand trial and understood the wrongfulness of his actions, but that his personality disorder was so severe that he would always represent a danger to others and could never be safely released into society. The federal prosecution of Gerald Voss moved forward with exceptional speed, given the overwhelming evidence and his own documented confessions in the files found at his torture facility. He was charged with 11 counts of kidnapping resulting in death, 1 count of kidnapping in the case of Caleb Drummond, who had survived, multiple counts of interstate stalking, and various weapons and fraud charges related to the false identities and illegal equipment he had used in his crimes. Federal prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that Voss's crimes were particularly heinous and depraved, involved extensive planning and premeditation, and demonstrated such complete disregard for human life that no other sentence would be appropriate. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with prosecutors presenting the evidence methodically and comprehensively, building an overwhelming case that left no doubt about Voss's guilt or the calculated nature of his crimes. Caleb Drummond testified about his abduction and captivity, describing the hours of psychological torture he had endured and the certainty he had felt that he would become another of Voss's murder victims. Drummond's testimony was powerful and emotional, providing the jury with a direct window into the experience of being Voss's captive and the lasting trauma that would affect him for the rest of his life. Officer Darius Henshaw and Vera Langford both testified about their roles in the investigation, with the prosecution using their testimony to establish the timeline of events and to demonstrate the immediate law enforcement response that had ultimately saved Drummond's life. The recording of Vera's 911 call with Drummond was played for the jury, and several jurors were visibly moved by the fear in Drummond's voice and the professional calm that Vera maintained while trying to help him. The moment when the unknown voice said, "Found you, Caleb," and the phone went dead was particularly impactful, providing the jury with an audio document of the exact instant when Drummond passed from freedom into captivity. The defense attempted to argue that Voss's mental illness diminished his culpability and that he deserved treatment rather than execution, but the prosecution's psychiatric experts testified that, while Voss certainly suffered from severe personality disorder, he was not insane in the legal sense and had demonstrated clear understanding of right and wrong through his elaborate efforts to avoid detection. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, and after a brief penalty phase hearing, they recommended the death penalty. The judge sentenced Gerald Voss to death by lethal injection, along with multiple life sentences without possibility of parole on the kidnapping and related charges. In his sentencing remarks, the judge noted that Voss's crimes represented a profound betrayal of the military values of honor and service, and that his deliberate targeting of veterans who had served their country with distinction was an aggravating factor that justified the maximum penalty. Voss was transferred to federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he would spend years exhausting his appeals before ultimately facing execution. For Caleb Drummond, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle. The long process of recovering from psychological trauma and rebuilding a life that had been shattered by his encounter with Gerald Voss. Drummond received extensive counseling through Veterans Affairs programs, and eventually became an advocate for military veterans suffering from PTSD and other service-related psychological conditions. He frequently spoke about his experience, not dwelling on the details of his captivity, but instead focusing on the importance of mental health support for veterans, and the warning signs that might indicate someone was being targeted by predators who specifically sought out veterans as victims. The aftermath of the Gerald Voss case sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the Southwest, fundamentally changing how police departments approached missing persons cases involving military veterans and forcing a reevaluation of how predators could exploit the vulnerabilities of those who had served their country. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office established a specialized unit dedicated to investigating crimes against veterans, recognizing that this population faced unique threats from individuals who specifically targeted them because of their military experience and the psychological vulnerabilities that sometimes resulted from combat service. Officer Darius Henshaw was promoted to detective and assigned to lead this new unit, bringing his first-hand experience from the Drummond case and his deep commitment to protecting those who had worn the uniform. Detective Henshaw's first priority was to ensure that all 11 families who had lost loved ones to Gerald Voss received closure and support. He personally contacted each family, providing them with detailed briefings about how their loved ones had been targeted, what had happened during their captivity, and how the investigation had ultimately brought Voss to justice. These conversations were among the most difficult of Henshaw's career, as he had to balance the family's need for information with the necessity of sparing them the most horrific details of what their loved ones had endured. Several families expressed gratitude that at least they now knew what had happened and could begin the process of grieving properly, rather than living with the uncertainty and false hope that had characterized the years when their loved ones were simply missing. Vera Langford continued working as a 911 dispatcher, but the Drummond case had marked her in ways that would influence the rest of her career. She had always taken her responsibility seriously, understanding that the voice on the other end of an emergency call represented a human being in crisis who deserved her full attention and best efforts. But after spending those terrifying minutes on the phone with Caleb Drummond, listening to him describe being hunted through the desert and then hearing the moment of his capture, Vera approached every call with renewed intensity and a deeper understanding of how critical her role could be in determining whether someone lived or died. She became an instructor at the Regional 911 Training Academy, using the Drummond case as a teaching example of how proper call handling, accurate information gathering, and coordination with responding officers could make the difference between tragedy and survival. In her training sessions, Vera would play portions of the recorded call, carefully edited to remove the most distressing elements while preserving the essential lessons about maintaining communication with callers in crisis. Gathering detailed location information despite challenging circumstances, and recognizing when a situation required immediate priority response rather than routine handling. She emphasized that Drummond had survived, in part because she had taken his report seriously from the first moment, had coordinated effectively with Officer Henshaw, and had maintained her professional composure even when the situation seemed hopeless. The recording of that terrible moment, when the unknown voice Ostun said, "Found you, Caleb," became a powerful tool for teaching new dispatchers about the emotional resilience required for the job and the importance of continuing to work the case even when direct communication with the caller was lost. Caleb Drummond's recovery was long and difficult, involving months of intensive therapy to address the post-traumatic stress disorder that resulted from his captivity and the specific psychological techniques that Voss had employed to break down his mental defenses. The Veterans Affairs Hospital in Phoenix provided comprehensive treatment, but Drummond struggled with nightmares, hypervigilance, and difficulty trusting others, all common symptoms among trauma survivors, but particularly severe in his case because his captor had been a former military officer who had perverted the trust and authority relationships that were fundamental to military culture. Drummond found it especially difficult to interact with anyone in positions of authority, as Voss had exploited his military training and instinct to obey orders during the interrogation sessions. What ultimately helped Drummond begin to heal was his decision to transform his trauma into advocacy. Working with veterans organizations and mental health professionals, Drummond developed educational programs designed to help other veterans recognize when they might be vulnerable to predators and to encourage them to seek help for psychological issues before those issues could be exploited. He spoke openly about his own struggles with readjusting to civilian life after military service, about the isolation many veterans felt, and about how that isolation had made him an attractive target for someone like Gerald Voss. Drummond's willingness to discuss his experience helped reduce the stigma many veterans felt about admitting vulnerability or seeking mental health treatment, potentially preventing other veterans from becoming victims of similar predators. Drummond maintained close relationships with both Vera Langford and Detective Henshaw, the two people whose actions had directly saved his life. He would occasionally visit the dispatch center where Vera worked, speaking to new dispatchers about the importance of their role and expressing gratitude that Vera had been the one who answered his call that desperate night in the desert. He told them that hearing Vera's calm, professional voice during those minutes when he was being hunted had provided him with a psychological anchor, a reminder that he was not completely alone and that help was coming even if it seemed impossibly far away. These visits were emotionally difficult for Vera, who struggled with her own trauma response from having been virtually present during Drummond's capture. But she found meaning in knowing that her work had genuinely mattered in the most literal sense possible. Detective Henshaw and Drummond developed a friendship that went beyond the professional relationship between investigator and victim. They would occasionally meet for coffee, conversations that ranged from discussing the challenges of dealing with trauma to sharing experiences from their respective military service. Henshaw had served 4 years in the Marine Corps before joining the sheriff's office, and he understood the unique perspective that military experience brought to civilian life. These conversations helped both men process their experiences with the Voss case, Drummond from the perspective of having survived it, and Henshaw from the perspective of having been responsible for the investigation that brought it to resolution. The broader law enforcement community drew numerous lessons from the Voss case, implementing changes that would affect how agencies throughout the country approached similar investigations. The FBI established a national database specifically tracking crimes against military veterans, recognizing that predators like Voss often operated across multiple jurisdictions, and that patterns might only become visible when cases were analyzed collectively rather than in isolation. This database helped investigators identify suspicious patterns earlier, potentially preventing additional victims by allowing law enforcement to recognize serial predators before they could claim multiple lives. The case also led to enhanced cooperation between the Department of Veterans Affairs and law enforcement agencies, with protocols established for sharing information when veterans went missing or were believed to be at risk. The VA began training its counselors and caseworkers to recognize warning signs that might indicate a veteran was being stalked or targeted, and procedures were implemented for immediately reporting such concerns to appropriate law enforcement agencies. These changes were directly inspired by the Voss investigation's revelation that several of his victims had been receiving VA services and might have been identified as vulnerable if proper information-sharing mechanisms had existed. Special Agent Marcus Bellamy of the FBI continued working violent crimes cases throughout the Southwest, but the Voss investigation remained one of the most significant cases of his career. The multi-jurisdictional cooperation that had been necessary to solve the case became a model for how federal and local agencies could work together effectively on complex serial crimes. Bellamy frequently spoke at law enforcement conferences about the investigation, emphasizing the importance of recognizing patterns across jurisdictional boundaries and maintaining open communication channels between agencies that might be investigating related cases without realizing the connections. Detective Sarah Kovacs, who had led the investigative task force that ultimately rescued Drummond and arrested Voss, was promoted to lieutenant and given command of the Sheriff's Office Major Crimes Unit. She used her experience from the Voss case to develop new protocols for investigating cases involving potential serial offenders, emphasizing the importance of thorough evidence collection, comprehensive database searches for similar cases, and rapid coordination with federal resources when patterns suggested crimes crossing state lines. Kovacs became a recognized expert in serial crime investigation and was frequently consulted by other agencies facing complex cases that might involve offenders operating across multiple jurisdictions. The abandoned mine property where Voss had held his victims was seized by federal authorities through asset forfeiture proceedings and was eventually demolished, with the land being transferred to the Bureau of Land Management for inclusion in protected wilderness areas. Before demolition, the site was thoroughly documented by forensic investigators and became a training location where law enforcement personnel could learn proper procedures for processing complex crime scenes. The decision to demolish rather than preserve the buildings was made out of respect for the victims and their families, who expressed strong feelings that the physical location of so much suffering should not be allowed to stand as a monument to Voss's crimes. A memorial was eventually established at the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office headquarters, honoring the 11 veterans who had been murdered by Gerald Voss and recognizing the investigative work that had prevented additional victims. The memorial included photographs of each victim in their military uniforms, serving as a reminder of their service and sacrifice, both in uniform and as tragic victims of violence after their return to civilian life. Caleb Drummond attended the memorial dedication, standing alongside the families of those who had not survived, united in their shared trauma and their determination that these crimes would not be forgotten. The legal proceedings against Gerald Voss continued for years through the appeals process, as his defense attorneys raised numerous challenges to his conviction and death sentence. These appeals focused on technical legal issues rather than disputing his guilt, which was established beyond any doubt by the overwhelming evidence. Voss himself showed no remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing, instead using his court appearances to make rambling statements about the importance of his research and his belief that he had been conducting legitimate military operations. These statements only reinforced the correctness of the jury's verdict and the appropriateness of the death sentence, as they demonstrated that Voss remained dangerous and delusional even after years of incarceration. The psychological impact of the case extended beyond the direct participants to affect the broader veteran community throughout Arizona and the Southwest. Many veterans reported increased anxiety about their personal safety and concerns about being targeted because of their military service. Veterans organizations worked to address these fears while also using the Voss case as an opportunity to discuss the importance of maintaining social connections, seeking help for psychological issues, and being aware of potential threats. The case unfortunately confirmed what many veterans had already felt, that their service made them targets in certain circumstances, but it also demonstrated that law enforcement took crimes against veterans seriously and would dedicate significant resources to protecting them and bringing perpetrators to justice. For the civilian community, the Voss case provided disturbing insights into how predators could operate in plain sight, using false identities and carefully planned operations to commit horrific crimes while avoiding detection for years. The sophistication of Voss's operation, his use of multiple vehicles and locations, his creation of false identities, and his ability to conduct extensive surveillance without arousing suspicion, all demonstrated that modern criminals could employ tactics that made them difficult to detect and apprehend. This realization led to increased public awareness about personal security and the importance of reporting suspicious activity, even when that activity might seem innocent or explainable on its surface. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about how the military identified and managed service members who exhibited dangerous psychological traits. Voss's service record had included clear warnings about his sadistic tendencies and his inappropriate satisfaction from wielding power over vulnerable individuals. Yet, he had been allowed to continue working in positions where he had authority over detainees until the allegations became so serious that a court-martial was unavoidable. After his discharge, there had been no system for tracking him or ensuring he received treatment, allowing him to simply disappear into civilian life where his dangerous traits could manifest without any oversight or intervention. These failures led to reforms in how the military handled discharges related to psychological issues and improved information sharing with civilian law enforcement when discharged service members posed potential threats to public safety. 10 years after the night when Caleb Drummond made his desperate 911 call from the Arizona desert, the case remained a powerful example of how effective law enforcement response could save lives and bring dangerous criminals to justice. Vera Langford, now a supervisor in the 911 center, still thought about that call frequently, remembering the fear in Drummond's voice and the terrible moment when the connection was lost. She had handled thousands of emergency calls in the decades since, each one receiving her full professional attention. But the Drummond call remained the most significant of her career, the one that reminded her why her job mattered and why she had chosen to dedicate her professional life to helping people in their worst moments. Detective Henshaw, now a lieutenant commanding the Crimes Against Veterans unit he had helped establish, had investigated dozens of cases involving threats to military veterans, preventing numerous potential tragedies by identifying dangerous patterns early and intervening before violence could occur. The unit had become a model for similar programs in other states, demonstrating that specialized law enforcement attention to vulnerable populations could make a measurable difference in preventing violent crimes. Henshaw frequently returned to the desert location where he had first responded to Vera's dispatch about Drummond's situation, using the site for training exercises with new officers and as a reminder of why thorough investigation and rapid response were so critical in missing persons cases. Caleb Drummond had rebuilt his life in ways that would have seemed impossible during the dark months after his rescue. He had completed his education, earning a degree in psychology with a focus on trauma recovery, and now worked as a counselor specializing in treating veterans suffering from PTSD and trauma-related conditions. His own experience gave him unique credibility and insight when working with veteran clients, many of whom found it easier to trust someone who had survived similar darkness and emerged intact on the other side. Drummond had also married and started a family, milestones that represented his reclamation of a normal life from the shadow of Gerald Voss's crimes. Gerald Voss remained on death row, his appeals gradually exhausting themselves as courts repeatedly rejected his challenges to the conviction and sentence. He would eventually be executed, though the exact timing remained uncertain, as the federal death penalty process moved slowly through its required procedures. When that execution finally occurred, it would bring a form of closure to the families of his victims and would eliminate any possibility that he could ever threaten another veteran. But for those whose lives he had touched, Drummond, the investigators, and the families of his victims, the scars would remain long after Voss himself was gone. The story of that October night when Caleb Drummond was hunted through the Arizona desert, made a desperate call for help, and was ultimately rescued by the coordinated efforts of dedicated law enforcement professionals, became part of the training curriculum at police academies throughout the Southwest. It served as an example of how emergency calls should be handled, how investigations should be conducted, and how different agencies could work together effectively to achieve outcomes that no single agency could accomplish alone. The case demonstrated that behind every 911 call was a human being deserving of help, that persistence and professionalism in investigation could overcome even sophisticated criminal operations, and that law enforcement officers who took their oath to protect and serve seriously could make life or death differences in the lives of those they served. For Vera Langford, Darius Henshaw, and Caleb Drummond, the bonds forged during that desperate night created connections that would last their entire lives. They had been brought together by violence and crisis, but they had emerged from that darkness with a shared understanding of what it meant to face evil and prevail through courage, dedication, and the fundamental human capacity to help others in their most desperate moments. Their story was ultimately not about the horrors that Gerald Voss had inflicted, but about the triumph of those who had stopped him, saved a life, and ensured that justice was done. It was a story about why the work of law enforcement mattered, why every 911 call deserved serious attention, and why good people who chose to serve their communities could make the world a safer place, one emergency call at a time. The November rain fell steadily across Holmes County, Ohio, turning the unpaved rural roads into ribbons of mud that wound through farmland where Amish buggies still shared the roadways with pickup trucks and agricultural equipment. Deputy Sheriff Tobias Claiborne had been patrolling these back roads for 11 years, long enough to know every curve, every hidden driveway, and every family that lived in the scattered farmhouses dotting the countryside between Millersburg and the smaller settlements that most people from outside the county had never heard of. At 42 years old, Claiborne had grown up in this area, had attended the small consolidated high school, and had returned after 6 years in the Army to serve the community that had shaped him. He understood the rhythms of rural life, the self-sufficiency of farm families, and the deep privacy that characterized people who lived miles from their nearest neighbors. The 911 call came through at 7:43 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in mid-November, dispatched by Gordon Maddox, the night supervisor at the Holmes County Emergency Communications Center. Maddox had been working dispatch for the county for 19 years, and his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had handled thousands of emergency calls and could distinguish between genuine crisis and routine problems that simply felt urgent to the caller. But there was something in Maddox's tone as he relayed the call details that made Claiborne pay closer attention than usual, a note of concern that suggested this was not a typical complaint about barking dogs or a minor traffic accident on a rural highway. The caller was a woman named Eunice Perrin, age 67, who lived alone on a 50-acre property on Township Road 362, about 8 miles northeast of Millersburg, in an area where farms were separated by wooded lots, and the nearest neighbor might be half a mile away. Maddox explained that Perrin had called to report hearing sounds coming from inside her house, specifically from the basement, sounds that she insisted could not be explained by normal settling, animals, or plumbing issues. She had been adamant that someone was in her basement, moving around, and possibly trying to access the main floor of her house. Maddox had tried to determine if Perrin had actually seen anyone, or if doors or windows showed signs of forced entry, but she had been unable to confirm visual contact with an intruder, only that she could hear distinct sounds of movement below her. Claiborne acknowledged the call and began driving toward Perrin's property, his patrol vehicle's headlights cutting through the rainy darkness as he navigated the narrow township roads. He knew the general area where Perrin lived, a section of the county that was transitioning from active farming to properties owned by people who wanted rural privacy but did not work the land. Many of these properties had been in families for generations, but were now being sold off as older residents died or moved to assisted living facilities, with the land being purchased by newcomers attracted to Holmes County's reputation for safety, natural beauty, and distance from urban problems. Claiborne had responded to calls at several of these properties over the years, usually involving residents who were not accustomed to rural living, and became alarmed by sounds that longtime country dwellers would recognize as normal. As Claiborne drove, he radioed Maddox for additional information about Eunice Perrin and her property. Maddox consulted the county's computer-aided dispatch system and reported that Perrin had lived at the Township Road 362 address for approximately 4 years, having purchased the property in 2019. She had made 3 previous 911 calls during her residence there, all relatively minor issues, including a medical call when she had fallen and injured her wrist, a call about suspicious vehicles on her property that turned out to be hunters who had mistakenly crossed onto her land, and a welfare check request when she had not heard from an elderly neighbor for several days. The calls suggested someone who was cautious but not paranoid, someone who used 911 appropriately when she had legitimate concerns but did not abuse the system with frivolous complaints. The property record showed that Perrin's house had been built in 1947, a typical post-war farmhouse on a foundation that included a full basement, which was common for houses in this area where basements provided storm shelter and utility space. The property had previously been owned by the Burkhart family for over 60 years before being sold to Perrin, and during the Burkhart ownership there had been no unusual police calls or incidents reported at the address. Claiborne made a mental note of the Burkhart name, as he vaguely remembered that family, though he could not immediately recall specific details about them or the circumstances of their departure from the property. Claiborne reached Township Road 362 and turned onto the gravel driveway leading to Perrin's house, his vehicle's tires crunching on the wet stone as he approached a modest single-story farmhouse with white vinyl siding and a metal roof. The house sat back about 200 feet from the road, surrounded by overgrown fields that had not been cultivated in years, and bordered by tree lines that marked the boundaries with neighboring properties. A single porch light illuminated the front door, and Claiborne could see lights on inside the house, suggesting that Perrin was awake and waiting for his arrival. He parked near the front porch, noting that there were no other vehicles visible, and no obvious signs of disturbance around the property's perimeter. Before approaching the house, Claiborne conducted a quick visual sweep of the property with his flashlight, looking for any signs of forced entry or suspicious activity. The windows on the ground floor were intact and showed no signs of tampering. The doors appeared secure, and there were no footprints in the mud around the foundation that would suggest someone had recently approached the house from outside. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, which meant that any tracks made in the past few hours would be visible in the soft ground. But Claiborne saw no evidence of foot traffic except what appeared to be Perrin's own tracks leading from her car, which was parked in a detached garage about 30 feet from the house. Claiborne approached the front door and knocked, identifying himself as a deputy with the Holmes County Sheriff's Office. The woman who opened the door matched the description Maddox had provided, an elderly woman of slight build with gray hair pulled back in a bun, wearing practical clothing that suggested someone accustomed to living alone and managing her own household. Eunice Perrin's face showed obvious relief at seeing the deputy, but also a kind of determined anxiety that suggested she was not someone who frightened easily, but was genuinely concerned about what she had heard in her basement. Perrin invited Claiborne inside, and he immediately noted that the house was clean and well-maintained, with modest furnishings that suggested someone living on a fixed income, but taking pride in her home. Family photographs covered the walls and tabletops, showing what appeared to be children and grandchildren at various ages. The house had the quiet, orderly atmosphere of someone who lived alone by choice or circumstance and had established comfortable routines that filled the solitude. There was no evidence of confusion or mental impairment in Perrin's manner or in the condition of her home. No signs that would suggest her concerns about sounds in the basement were the product of dementia or medication-related hallucinations. As Claiborne stood in the living room, Perrin explained what had prompted her 911 call. She had been in the kitchen preparing dinner around 6:30 p.m. when she had first heard sounds coming from the basement, sounds that she described as scraping and thumping, as if someone was moving furniture or boxes across the concrete floor. Initially, she had tried to rationalize the sounds as being caused by the old house settling, or perhaps an animal that had somehow gotten into the basement through a crack or gap in the foundation. But the sounds had continued intermittently for over an hour, and they had a rhythmic, purposeful quality that did not match what settling or animal activity would produce. Perrin led Claiborne to the kitchen, where a door opened onto a steep wooden staircase descending into darkness below. She explained that she had not gone down to the basement after hearing the sounds because she lived alone and was concerned about confronting an intruder in a confined space where she would have no easy escape route. Instead, she had locked the basement door, called 911, and waited for law enforcement to arrive. Claiborne approved of her caution, as entering a basement alone to investigate potential intruder activity was exactly the wrong approach for an elderly person living without backup or protection. Claiborne asked Perrin to remain upstairs while he investigated the basement, and he drew his service weapon before unlocking the basement door and beginning his descent. The wooden stairs creaked under his weight, and his flashlight beam swept across a typical farmhouse basement, a large open space with a concrete floor, exposed floor joists overhead, and a foundation made of rough stone and mortar. The basement contained the expected equipment and storage that accumulated over decades: an old furnace, a water heater, various tools and gardening equipment, boxes of stored belongings, and furniture that had been relegated to storage rather than discarded. As Claiborne moved through the basement, his flashlight revealed no obvious signs of human presence. There were no fresh footprints in the dust that covered parts of the floor, no disturbed areas that would suggest someone had recently been moving through the space. The small ground-level windows that provided the only natural light to the basement were covered with years of grime and cobwebs, and none showed any signs of having been opened or breached from outside. Claiborne checked each corner of the basement methodically, looking behind stored items and in spaces where someone might conceal themselves, but found no one hiding and no evidence that anyone had recently been in the space. However, as Claiborne completed his initial sweep of the basement, his flashlight beam caught something that made him pause and look more carefully. Along the far wall of the basement, the one that faced toward the tree line at the back of the property, there was a section of concrete floor that appeared different from the rest. The concrete in this area was newer, lighter in color, and the surface texture was different from the original basement floor, which had been poured decades ago and had developed the characteristic roughness and discoloration that came with age. The newer concrete section was roughly rectangular, approximately 8 feet long by 4 feet wide, and it appeared to have been poured at some point within the past few years based on its condition. Claiborne crouched down to examine the newer concrete more closely, running his flashlight beam along the edges where it met the older floor. The seam was relatively neat but not professional. suggesting the work of someone who had basic concrete skills but was not a trained mason. What struck Claiborne as unusual was the location and size of this repaired section. If the original basement floor had developed cracks or other problems requiring repair, the repairs would typically be done in smaller sections addressing specific problem areas, not in one large rectangular patch that suggested something had been removed from or placed beneath the floor. Claiborne stood up and conducted a more thorough examination of the basement, paying particular attention to the area around the newer concrete section. He noticed that there was significantly less dust and debris accumulated on the newer concrete compared to the surrounding older floor, which made sense given that it was newer, but also suggested that this section of floor had not been in place for very long. Looking at the stored items in the basement, Claiborne observed that the boxes and furniture were arranged in a way that left the newer concrete section relatively clear, as if someone wanted to be able to access this area without having to move a lot of stored items out of the way. Claiborne also noticed something else that seemed potentially significant. Near the newer concrete section, there were marks on the stone foundation wall that appeared to be relatively fresh scratches or abrasions, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor and had bumped against the wall. The marks were at a height that suggested whatever had caused them had been substantial in size, possibly furniture or equipment being moved across the basement floor. These marks did not prove that anything sinister had occurred, but combined with the newer concrete section and the sounds that Perrin had reported, they created a pattern that concerned Claiborne and suggested this might warrant further investigation beyond a simple check for an intruder. Claiborne returned upstairs and found Perrin waiting anxiously in the kitchen. He assured her that he had found no one in the basement and no signs of forced entry, but he also told her about the newer concrete section he had observed and asked her if she knew anything about when or why that repair had been made. Perrin looked genuinely surprised by the question and said she had never noticed any difference in the basement floor, though she admitted she rarely went down there except to check the furnace or retrieve stored items. She said the basement had been in its current condition when she purchased the house 4 years earlier, and she had not made any modifications or repairs to that area. This information increased Claiborne's concern, as it meant the concrete repair had been done either shortly before Perrin purchased the property or during the final years of the previous owner's occupancy. Claiborne asked Perrin what she knew about the property's history and the previous owners, and she explained that the house had belonged to the Burkhart family for many years. The last occupant had been a man named Harold Burkhart, who had lived alone in the house after his wife died in the early 2000s. Harold Burkhart had eventually moved to a nursing home due to declining health, and the property had been sold through his estate after his death in 2018. Claiborne asked if Perrin had ever met Harold Burkhart or knew anything about his family, and she said she had never met him personally, but had heard from neighbors that he had been a solitary man who kept to himself in his later years. She also mentioned that when she purchased the property, the house had required significant cleaning and minor repairs, as it had been vacant for over a year between Burkhart's move to the nursing home and the estate sale. The basement had been full of accumulated belongings that she had either kept or donated to charity, and she had not paid particular attention to the condition of the floor beyond noting that the basement was dry and did not appear to have moisture problems. Claiborne decided that the situation warranted additional investigation, both to address Perrin's concerns about the sounds she had heard and to document the unusual concrete section in case it proved to be relevant to some past event or crime. He asked Perrin's permission to take photographs of the basement, which she readily granted, and he spent the next 20 minutes documenting the newer concrete section, the marks on the foundation wall, and the overall condition of the basement. He also took measurements of the concrete section and made detailed notes about its location and characteristics for his incident report. As Claiborne was preparing to leave, Perrin mentioned something else that seemed potentially relevant. She said that over the past few months, she had occasionally noticed her stored items in the basement had been rearranged slightly, boxes moved or furniture shifted in ways that she could not remember doing herself. She had attributed this to her own memory failures, assuming she had moved things and forgotten about it. But now she wondered if someone had actually been entering her basement without her knowledge. She said she always kept the exterior doors to her house locked, but she admitted that the basement windows, while painted shut and covered with grime, might be vulnerable if someone was determined to gain access. Claiborne examined the basement windows more carefully with his flashlight and found that while they appeared secure, one window on the side of the house facing away from the driveway showed signs that someone had attempted to clean the exterior surface, removing some of the accumulated grime in a way that might allow someone to see inside. The window itself was still painted shut and would be difficult to open from outside, but the partial cleaning suggested that someone had taken an interest in what was stored in the basement or wanted to observe the interior without being noticed from inside the house. This discovery elevated Claiborne's concern from simple home security to potential criminal activity. Someone appeared to have been conducting surveillance of Perrin's basement, possibly looking for something or monitoring whether anyone was investigating the newer concrete section. Combined with Perrin's report of hearing sounds in the basement and her observations about stored items being rearranged, the evidence suggested that someone had been entering the property, possibly through methods that left no obvious traces, and had been conducting activities in the basement that they wanted to keep concealed from the homeowner. Claiborne decided to contact the Sheriff's Office Detective Division and request that an investigator follow up on this case. He explained the situation to Perrin and assured her that he would recommend increased patrols of her property and that a detective would likely want to interview her more thoroughly about the property's history and any suspicious activity she had observed. He also advised her to have a security system installed if possible, or at minimum to keep all doors and windows locked, and to call 911 immediately if she observed any suspicious activity or heard unusual sounds again. Before leaving Perrin's property, Claiborne conducted another exterior sweep with his flashlight, this time paying particular attention to the ground around the basement windows and looking for any signs of foot traffic or disturbance. Near the window that showed signs of cleaning, he found faint impressions in the mud that might be footprints, though the rain had degraded them to the point where they were not clear enough for useful documentation. However, the impression suggested that someone had stood at that window relatively recently, possibly within the past few days, and had spent enough time there to leave multiple overlapping prints. Claiborne photographed the faint impressions as best he could given the conditions and the poor lighting, knowing that while they might not be sufficient for forensic identification, they would at least document that someone had been near the basement window in a location where there was no legitimate reason for anyone to be. He also examined the other basement windows and found that two others showed similar signs of partial cleaning on the exterior, suggesting that whoever had been surveilling the basement had checked multiple access points and windows to get different views of the interior. As Claiborne drove away from Perrin's property, heading back toward Millersburg to complete his shift, he found himself deeply troubled by what he had observed. In 11 years of working as a deputy in Holmes County, he had developed reliable instincts about when situations were more serious than they initially appeared, and everything about this call suggested that Eunice Perrin's concerns were justified and that something significant was buried in the history of her property. The newer concrete section in the basement, the surveillance of the windows, the reported sounds and rearranged items, all pointed toward someone having a strong interest in that basement and possibly wanting to access something that had been concealed there. Claiborne's experience told him that when people went to the trouble of pouring concrete in basements to cover something, they were usually hiding things they did not want discovered. Sometimes it was simply old wells or cisterns that had been filled in for safety reasons, or utility lines that had been rerouted and covered. But sometimes concrete was used to conceal evidence of crimes, to hide bodies or contraband or other material that would be incriminating if discovered. The rectangular shape and size of the newer concrete section in Perrin's basement was particularly concerning because it was roughly the dimensions that would be used to conceal a grave, though Claiborne tried to avoid jumping to that conclusion without further evidence. Back at the sheriff's office, Claiborne wrote a detailed incident report documenting his response to Perrin's 911 call and everything he had observed at her property. He flagged the report as requiring detective follow-up and included his photographs and measurements of the basement concrete section. He also requested that the Records Division pull any historical information about the Burkhart family and the Township Road 362 property, including previous police calls, building permits, and any other documentation that might shed light on when and why the basement floor had been repaired. Gordon Maddox, the dispatcher who had taken Perrin's original call, stopped by Claiborne's desk as he was finishing his report. Maddox mentioned that after the call had concluded, he had been curious about the property history and had done some informal research using the dispatch system's databases. He had found something interesting that Claiborne might want to know about. In 2003, approximately 2 years before Harold Burkhart's wife had died, there had been a missing persons report filed regarding a young woman named Sarah Burkhart, age 19, who was Harold and Dorothy Burkhart's granddaughter. According to Maddox's research, Sarah Burkhart had been living with her grandparents on the Township Road 362 property, while attending Kent State University's regional campus in nearby New Philadelphia. She had disappeared in late October 2003, simply failing to return home one evening after classes. Her car had been found abandoned in the campus parking lot, but there had been no sign of Sarah herself, no indication of where she had gone or what had happened to her. The missing persons investigation had been extensive at the time, involving multiple law enforcement agencies and generating significant media attention, but Sarah Burkhart had never been found, and the case remained unsolved. This information sent a chill through Claiborne as he considered the implications. A young woman had disappeared from the property where Eunice Perrin now lived, vanishing without a trace nearly 2 decades ago. The case had never been solved, and now there was a suspicious concrete section in the basement that appeared to have been poured sometime in the years after Sarah's disappearance. The connection might be coincidental, but Claiborne's instincts told him that these facts were related, and that the sounds Eunice Perrin had heard in her basement might be connected to secrets that had been buried there for years. Claiborne immediately contacted the Detective Division's night supervisor and briefed him on the situation, emphasizing the potential connection between the newer concrete in the basement and the unsolved disappearance of Sarah Burkhart. The supervisor agreed that this warranted immediate attention and promised to assign a detective to investigate first thing in the morning. In the meantime, Claiborne was authorized to request that a patrol unit conduct periodic checks of Perrin's property throughout the night to ensure her safety and to watch for any suspicious activity that might indicate someone was attempting to access the property. As his shift ended and Claiborne prepared to go home, he found himself unable to stop thinking about Eunice Perrin alone in that house, sleeping above a basement that might contain the answer to a 20-year-old mystery. He thought about Sarah Burkhart, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind family members who had spent 2 decades wondering what had happened to her and whether she had suffered. And he thought about Harold Burkhart, the elderly man who had lived alone in that house for years after his wife's death, who might have known terrible secrets about what had happened to his granddaughter and had taken those secrets to his grave. The rain continued to fall across Holmes County, washing across the fields and forests, soaking into the ground where countless secrets lay buried beneath the surface of this quiet rural landscape. Somewhere in that darkness, answers waited to be uncovered, and Tobias Claiborne knew that tomorrow would bring a reckoning with the past that would change everything for Eunice Perrin and possibly provide long-delayed justice for Sarah Burkhart and her family. Detective Maria Kovacs arrived at the Holmes County Sheriff's Office at 7:30 a.m., having been briefed by phone about Deputy Claiborne's overnight report and the potential connection to the Sarah Burkhart missing persons case. Kovacs had been with the Sheriff's Office for 13 years, the last 7 as a detective specializing in major crimes and cold cases, and she had a reputation for thoroughness and persistence that had solved several cases other investigators had given up on. At 39 years old, Kovacs brought a combination of analytical thinking and investigative instinct that made her ideally suited for cases involving historical crimes and complex evidence patterns. Kovacs spent the first hour of her day reviewing every document related to the Sarah Burkhart disappearance, pulling files from the Records Division that dated back to 2003, when the case had been front-page news throughout Holmes County and the surrounding region. The original investigation had been extensive, involving the Holmes County Sheriff's Office, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and FBI agents who specialized in missing persons cases. Sarah Burkhart had been a 19-year-old college student with no history of running away, no involvement with drugs or criminal activity, and no apparent reason to disappear voluntarily. Her disappearance had been sudden and complete, with no witnesses, no evidence of foul play, and no trace of where she had gone or what had happened to her. The case file documented hundreds of interviews conducted with Sarah's family members, friends, classmates, professors, and anyone else who might have had contact with her in the days before her disappearance. Her grandparents, Harold and Dorothy Burkhart, had been interviewed extensively and had cooperated fully with investigators. Both had appeared genuinely devastated by Sarah's disappearance and had no explanation for where she might have gone. The investigation had found no evidence of family conflict, no suggestion of abuse or problems in Sarah's relationship with her grandparents, and no indication that anyone in the family had been involved in her disappearance. Harold Burkhart had been 71 years old at the time of Sarah's disappearance, a retired machinist who had worked for a manufacturing company in Millersburg for over 40 years before retiring in the late 1990s. His wife Dorothy had been 68, a homemaker who had raised 3 children and had been helping to care for Sarah while she attended college. By all accounts, the Burkharts had been a typical rural Ohio family, hard-working, religious, and deeply connected to their community and extended family. The investigation had found nothing in their backgrounds that suggested capability or motive for harming their granddaughter. However, as Kovacs read through the file, she noticed something that the original investigators had documented, but apparently had not considered particularly significant. In January 2004, approximately 3 months after Sarah's disappearance, Harold Burkhart had applied for a building permit to make repairs to his basement, specifically to replace a section of concrete floor that he claimed had developed severe cracking and water damage. The permit application indicated that Burkhart planned to do the work himself, with the help of a nephew who had some concrete experience, and that the project would involve removing the damaged concrete, addressing drainage issues, and pouring a new floor section. The building inspector, who had reviewed the completed work in February 2004, had filed a brief report noting that the concrete repair appeared professionally done and met code requirements. The inspector's notes indicated that the new concrete section was approximately 8 feet by 4 feet, located along the back wall of the basement, and had been poured to match the thickness and grade of the original floor. The inspector had no concerns about the quality of work and had signed off on the permit without requiring any modifications or additional inspections. Kovacs felt her investigative instincts activate as she read this documentation. The timing was striking. Harold Burkhart had undertaken a concrete repair project in his basement just 3 months after his granddaughter disappeared, during the heart of winter when such work would be difficult and uncomfortable. The size and location of the concrete section matched exactly what Deputy Claiborne had observed and photographed at Eunice Perrin's property the previous night. And while the building inspector's report suggested legitimate repair work, the coincidental timing raised obvious questions about whether the concrete might have been covering something other than simple drainage problems. Kovacs pulled additional records related to the Burkhardt property, looking for any other documentation that might be relevant. She found that in March 2005, approximately 18 months after Sarah's disappearance, Dorothy Burkhardt had died of cancer at age 70. Harold had continued living alone on the property for another 12 years until declining health forced him to move to a nursing home in 2017. He had died in 2018 at age 86, and the property had been sold through his estate to Eunice Perrin in 2019. The records showed no other police calls or significant incidents at the property during Harold's occupancy, suggesting he had lived quietly and without drawing attention from law enforcement or neighbors. Kovacs contacted Deputy Claiborne, who had finished his shift hours earlier, but had asked to be notified when the detective assigned to the case was ready to proceed. Claiborne agreed to meet Kovacs at the Perrin property to walk her through what he had observed and to provide additional context that might not have been clear from his written report. Kovacs also contacted the county prosecutor's office to discuss the legal requirements for conducting a more invasive investigation of the basement, specifically whether they would need a search warrant or if Eunice Perrin's consent as the current property owner would be sufficient. The assistant prosecutor handling the consultation explained that while Perrin's consent would allow them to examine the property she owned, if they planned to actually excavate the basement floor, they should consider obtaining a search warrant based on probable cause to believe evidence of a crime might be concealed there. The warrant would protect the investigation from later legal challenges and would formalize the process in a way that would make any discovered evidence admissible in court. The prosecutor agreed that the combination of the unsolved disappearance, the suspicious timing of the concrete repair, and the recent reports of sounds and surveillance at the property provided sufficient probable cause to justify a warrant. Kovacs began preparing a warrant affidavit, while simultaneously arranging for the resources they would need if the warrant was approved and they decided to excavate the basement floor. She contacted the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and requested assistance from their crime scene specialists and forensic anthropologists, who would be necessary if they discovered human remains. She also arranged for ground-penetrating radar equipment that could scan beneath the concrete and potentially identify anomalies without requiring immediate excavation, giving them additional confirmation before they committed to the time and expense of breaking through the floor. By noon, Kovacs had completed her warrant affidavit and had submitted it to Judge Raymond Holbrook, who handled most criminal matters for Holmes County. The affidavit detailed the Sarah Burkhardt disappearance, the suspicious timing of the basement concrete repair, Deputy Claiborne's observations at the Perrin property, and the recent reports of sounds and surveillance that suggested someone had ongoing interest in the basement. Judge Holbrook reviewed the affidavit carefully, asked several clarifying questions about the timeline and the evidence, and then signed the search warrant, authorizing the sheriff's office to conduct a comprehensive examination of the basement at the Township Road 362 property, including the use of ground-penetrating radar and, if warranted, excavation of the concrete floor. Kovacs and Claiborne met at the Perrin property at 2:00 p.m., accompanied by 2 technicians from the Ohio BCI who were bringing ground-penetrating radar equipment. Eunice Perrin met them at the door, clearly anxious about what the investigation might reveal, but cooperative and understanding about the necessity of determining what, if anything, was concealed in her basement. Kovacs explained the search warrant and the investigative process, assuring Perrin that they would be as minimally invasive as possible and would repair any damage caused by their examination. Perrin asked if she should leave the property during the investigation, but Kovacs suggested she might prefer to stay nearby in case they needed to ask questions about the property or its history. The ground-penetrating radar equipment was carried down to the basement, and the technicians began the process of scanning the concrete floor, paying particular attention to the newer section that Claiborne had identified. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring the reflected signals that bounce back from objects or anomalies beneath the surface. Different materials reflect the signals differently, allowing trained technicians to identify voids, buried objects, disturbed soil, and other features that might not be visible from the surface. The technology was not perfect and required skilled interpretation, but it could provide valuable information about what lay beneath concrete floors without requiring immediate excavation. The technicians worked methodically, moving the radar unit back and forth across the newer concrete section, while monitoring the data on a laptop computer that displayed real-time images of the subsurface. Kovacs and Claiborne watched over their shoulders, trying to interpret the patterns appearing on the screen, but knowing they would need to wait for the technician's expert analysis before drawing conclusions. After approximately 45 minutes of scanning and data collection, the senior technician asked his colleague to confirm what he was seeing, and both men spent several minutes reviewing the images and discussing their interpretation in technical terms. Finally, the senior technician turned to Kovacs with a grave expression and explained what the ground-penetrating radar had revealed. Beneath the newer concrete section, at a depth of approximately 3 feet below the surface, there was a large anomaly that showed characteristics consistent with a void or disturbed soil that had been refilled. The anomaly was roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and extended to a depth of approximately 5 feet below the basement floor. The size, shape, and location of the anomaly were consistent with what would be expected if someone had dug a grave-sized hole in the basement, placed something in it, backfilled the hole with soil, and then poured concrete over the surface to conceal the disturbance. The technician cautioned that ground-penetrating radar could not definitively identify what was in the void, whether it was human remains, animal remains, buried objects, or simply disturbed soil from utility work or other legitimate construction. But he also noted that the characteristics of this particular anomaly, especially its regular shape and depth, were very similar to what he had observed in previous cases where human remains had been buried and concealed beneath concrete floors. He strongly recommended excavation if the investigators wanted to determine conclusively what was buried there. Kovacs felt the weight of this moment settle over her as she considered what the next steps would mean. If they excavated and found human remains, this would transform from a cold case review into an active homicide investigation that would reopen wounds for Sarah Burkhart's family and potentially destroy the reputation of the Burkhart family name in a community where that name had been respected for generations. If they excavated and found nothing, or found something innocent that explained the anomaly, they would have wasted significant resources and caused Eunice Perrin considerable disruption for no purpose. But doing nothing was not an option, not when a young woman's disappearance remained unsolved and evidence suggested her body might be buried in this basement. Kovacs called Sheriff Thomas Yoder, the elected head of the Holmes County Sheriff's Office, and briefed him on the situation. Yoder had been sheriff for 12 years and had been a lieutenant in the department back in 2003 when Sarah Burkhart disappeared, so he remembered the case well and understood its significance to the community. He authorized Kovacs to proceed with excavation, agreeing that the ground-penetrating radar results provided sufficient justification, and that the community deserved answers about what had happened to Sarah Burkhart, even if those answers were difficult and painful. The excavation could not begin immediately, as it required additional equipment and personnel that would take time to assemble. Kovacs arranged for a contractor with concrete cutting equipment to arrive the following morning, and she coordinated with the BCI forensic team to have anthropologists and evidence technicians standing by in case human remains were discovered. She also made the difficult decision to contact Sarah Burkhart's family and inform them that the investigation into their daughter's disappearance had been reopened based on new evidence, preparing them for the possibility that Sarah's remains might be found, but cautioning that the evidence was not yet conclusive. Sarah Burkhart's parents, Robert and Linda Burkhart, were now in their 60s and had spent the past 2 decades living with the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their daughter. Linda Burkhart broke down crying when Kovacs called to inform them about the investigation, while Robert's voice was hollow and distant, as if he had already grieved so many times that he had no emotional reserves left. They told Kovacs that they had always believed Sarah was dead, that despite holding on to hope for the first few years, they had eventually accepted that their daughter was not coming home alive. They had suspected that something had happened to her near the Burkhart property, as that was the last place she was known to have been, but they had never imagined that her own grandparents might have been involved. Kovacs was careful not to make accusations about Harold Burkhart's involvement, explaining that they were still investigating and gathering evidence, but she acknowledged that the timing of the basement concrete work raised questions that needed to be answered. The Burkharts told Kovacs that Harold had changed after Sarah's disappearance, becoming more withdrawn and isolated, rarely leaving the property and avoiding family gatherings where Sarah's disappearance might be discussed. Dorothy had remained more social until her illness, but even she had seemed burdened by something she could not or would not discuss. Both Robert and Linda said they had occasionally wondered if their parents knew more about Sarah's disappearance than they had admitted, but they had never pursued those suspicions because the idea was too painful to contemplate. That evening, Kovacs met with the investigative team that would be handling the excavation and subsequent investigation if remains were found. The team included Sheriff Yoder, Deputy Claiborne, several other deputies and detectives, BCI forensic specialists, and forensic anthropologists from Kent State University who specialized in identifying skeletal remains, and representatives from the county prosecutor's office who would handle any criminal charges if the investigation revealed evidence of homicide. Kovacs briefed everyone on the case history, the evidence they had gathered so far, and the procedures they would follow during the excavation to ensure that any evidence was properly preserved and documented. The plan called for the excavation to begin at 8:00 a.m. the following morning. The concrete contractor would use specialized cutting equipment to remove the newer concrete section without disturbing what lay beneath it. Once the concrete was removed, the BCI forensic team would carefully excavate the underlying soil using hand tools and systematic archaeological techniques to ensure that any evidence was properly documented and preserved. If human remains were discovered, the forensic anthropologist would oversee their careful removal and transportation to the county morgue, where a full examination would be conducted to determine identity, cause of death, and any other relevant forensic information. Kovacs spent much of the evening reviewing the original Sarah Burkhart investigation file, looking for any details or leads that might have been overlooked or not fully explored. She found several items of interest, including statements from Sarah's friends indicating that in the weeks before her disappearance, Sarah had seemed troubled about something but had not wanted to discuss what was bothering her. One friend recalled Sarah mentioning that she had discovered something at her grandparents' house that upset her, but Sarah had refused to provide details, saying only that she needed to think about what to do with the information. This statement had been noted by the original investigators but had not been followed up thoroughly because Sarah's friend could not provide specific information about what Sarah had discovered. At the time, investigators had assumed Sarah might have been referring to personal family issues or conflicts that were not relevant to her disappearance. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and new evidence, Kovacs wondered if Sarah had discovered something in her grandparents' house that had placed her in danger. Had she found evidence of some crime or secret that Harold Burkhart needed to keep hidden? Had that discovery led to a confrontation that ended in violence? Kovacs also found reports indicating that in the days immediately after Sarah's disappearance, Harold Burkhart had seemed unusually calm and stoic, not displaying the level of emotion that would be expected from a grandparent whose granddaughter had vanished. Several people who had visited the Burkhart home to offer support had commented on Harold's subdued reaction, though at the time this had been attributed to his personality and his generation's tendency to internalize emotions rather than displaying them publicly. But investigative experience had taught Kovacs that sometimes people appeared calm in the face of tragedy because they already knew the outcome and were not dealing with uncertainty the way genuinely concerned family members would be. As Kovacs prepared to leave the office for the night, Gordon Maddox stopped by her desk with additional information he had discovered while researching the case. Maddox explained that he had been working dispatch the night of Sarah Burkhart's disappearance in 2003, and while he had not taken the initial missing persons call, he remembered the case clearly because it had generated so much activity and concern throughout the county. Maddox said that he had always felt there was something not quite right about how Harold Burkhart had behaved during the investigation, but he had never been able to articulate exactly what bothered him about the old man's demeanor and responses. Maddox also mentioned that in the years after Sarah's disappearance, he had occasionally been called to dispatch patrol units to the Burkhart property for various minor issues, wellness checks, reports of suspicious activity, and other routine calls. He said that Harold had always seemed defensive when officers responded to his property, even for completely innocuous matters, and had been reluctant to allow anyone into his house beyond what was absolutely necessary. This behavior had struck Maddox as unusual for someone who had previously been cooperative with law enforcement and had welcomed their presence during the search for his granddaughter. Most significantly, Maddox recalled that in early 2004, shortly after Harold had completed the basement concrete work, there had been a call from a neighbor reporting foul odors coming from the Burkhart property. The responding deputy had checked with Harold, who had explained that the smell was from fertilizer he was using on his fields and from a dead animal, possibly a deer, that had died somewhere on his property. The deputy had accepted this explanation and had closed the call without further investigation. But now, knowing what they knew about the basement excavation and the suspicious timing, Maddox wondered if that odor report might have been related to whatever was buried beneath the concrete. This information added another piece to the disturbing puzzle that was emerging. If human remains had been buried in the Burkhart basement in late 2003 or early 2004, there would have been noticeable odors during the decomposition process, especially in the confined space of a basement. Harold's work pouring concrete over the gravesite might have been motivated in part by the need to contain those odors and prevent them from drawing attention. The timing of the neighbor's report, coming shortly after the concrete work was completed, suggested that some odors had escaped before the concrete was in place or had lingered in the basement area despite Harold's attempts at concealment. Kovacs thanked Maddox for the information and added it to her investigative file, noting that if remains were found during the excavation, they would need to carefully document the condition of the basement and any evidence of attempts to manage or conceal odors from decomposition. She also made a note to interview the neighbor who had made the original odor complaint, as that person might have observed other relevant activity at the Burkhart property during the critical period after Sarah's disappearance. The night before the excavation, Kovacs found herself unable to sleep, her mind churning through the details of the case and the implications of what they might find the next day. She thought about Sarah Burkhart, a 19-year-old woman with her entire life ahead of her, possibly murdered by the grandfather who was supposed to protect and care for her. She thought about Harold Burkhart, an elderly man who had lived with terrible secrets for over a decade, going through the motions of daily life while knowing that his granddaughter's body was buried in his basement. And she thought about Eunice Perrin, an innocent woman who had purchased a house expecting to spend her retirement years in peace, only to discover that her home contained the evidence of a 20-year-old murder. Kovacs also considered the technical challenges they would face during the excavation. If Sarah's body had been buried for 2 decades, the remains would be significantly decomposed, possibly skeletonized depending on the soil conditions and moisture levels in the basement. Identifying the remains and determining cause of death would require careful forensic analysis, and there was no guarantee that the evidence would be sufficient to definitively prove what had happened. They might find Sarah's body, but be unable to determine how she died or who was responsible, leaving the family with answers about her fate but not justice for her death. As the first light of dawn broke over Holmes County, Kovacs was already on her way to the Perrin property, where the excavation team was assembling their equipment and preparing for a day that would either solve one of the county's most haunting mysteries or raise new questions that might never be answered. Deputy Claiborne arrived shortly after Kovacs, and together they conducted a final briefing with the team members, ensuring everyone understood their roles and responsibilities. The contractor positioned his concrete cutting equipment, and the forensic specialists laid out their tools and documentation materials, preparing to carefully record every step of the excavation process. Eunice Perrin watched from her kitchen window as the law enforcement personnel gathered in her yard, preparing to literally unearth the secrets that had been hidden in her basement for 2 decades. She had lived in this house for 4 years, never knowing that beneath her feet lay evidence of a crime that had devastated a family and haunted a community. Now her home would forever be associated with this terrible discovery, and she wondered if she would ever feel comfortable living here again, knowing what the house had concealed and what horrors might be revealed in the hours ahead. At precisely 8 o'clock a.m., the contractor started his equipment, and the high-pitched whine of the concrete saw filled the basement as the blade bit into the surface, beginning the process of removing the concrete that Harold Burkhart had poured over his terrible secret 21 years earlier. The excavation had begun, and there was no turning back. The concrete saw's blade carved through the newer section of basement floor with methodical precision, sending up clouds of fine dust that the forensic team's ventilation equipment worked to contain and filter. The contractor operated the equipment with practiced efficiency, making careful cuts that outlined the rectangular section Detective Kovacs had marked based on the ground-penetrating radar results. The process took nearly 2 hours, as the contractor had to make multiple passes to cut through the full thickness of the concrete, which proved to be approximately 4 inches deep. Consistent with residential basement floor construction, but thicker than would typically be used for a simple repair patch. Once the cutting was complete, the contractor used pry bars and lifting equipment to carefully remove the concrete sections, revealing the dark soil beneath. The forensic team immediately moved in with their documentation equipment, photographing and measuring the exposed area before anyone was allowed to disturb the underlying material. Detective Kovacs watched intently as the forensic anthropologist, Patricia Hollis from Kent State University, examined the exposed soil and provided her initial assessment of what the excavation might reveal. Dr. Hollis noted that the soil beneath the concrete showed clear signs of disturbance, with a mixture of different soil types and textures that indicated it had been dug up and refilled at some point. The disturbed soil area matched the dimensions suggested by the ground-penetrating radar, approximately 6 feet long by 3 feet wide, and extended deeper than the surrounding undisturbed basement floor. The edges of the disturbed area were relatively well defined, suggesting that whoever had dug this hole had worked carefully to contain the excavation to a specific area and to minimize obvious evidence of disturbance. The forensic team began the painstaking process of excavating the disturbed soil using hand tools, working in carefully measured levels and screening every shovelful of dirt to ensure that no evidence was missed. This was slow, meticulous work that could not be rushed, as any remains discovered would need to be carefully exposed and documented in place before being removed. Deputy Claiborne assisted by maintaining a detailed log of the excavation, recording the depth and location of every item or observation noted by the forensic team, creating a comprehensive record that would be crucial for any subsequent legal proceedings. After approximately 45 minutes of excavation, having removed about 12 inches of soil from the surface, one of the forensic technicians encountered something that caused him to stop digging and call for Dr. Hollis. Using a soft brush, he carefully cleared away soil to reveal what appeared to be fabric, a dark material that might have been clothing or a blanket, partially preserved by the soil conditions but badly degraded by 2 decades underground. Dr. Hollis examined the material carefully, noting its position and apparent extent, then authorized the technicians to continue excavating around the fabric to determine what it contained. The atmosphere in the basement grew heavy with tension as the excavation continued and more of the fabric became visible. It appeared to be a heavy blanket or tarp that had been wrapped around something, creating a bundle that extended the full length of the disturbed soil area. The technicians worked with extreme care, using brushes and small hand tools to expose the bundle without disturbing its contents or destroying fragile evidence. Photographs were taken continuously, documenting every stage of the excavation and creating a visual record of how the burial site had been constructed and concealed. Detective Kovacs found herself holding her breath as Dr. Hollis finally determined that the bundle contained what appeared to be human skeletal remains. The forensic anthropologist's preliminary examination, conducted with the remains still partially buried and wrapped in the deteriorated fabric, suggested a single individual, likely young adult based on the size and condition of visible bones, with the skeleton appearing to be largely complete despite 2 decades of burial. Dr. Hollis recommended that they continue the careful exposure of the remains in place rather than attempting to lift the entire bundle, as this would allow for better documentation and would minimize the risk of losing small bones or other evidence during removal. The excavation continued throughout the morning and into the early afternoon, with Dr. Hollis and her team working with painstaking precision to expose and document every aspect of the burial. As more of the skeleton was revealed, Dr. Hollis was able to make increasingly confident assessments about what they had found. The remains appeared to be those of a young female, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, based on long bone measurements, with skeletal development consistent with late adolescence or early adulthood. The position of the remains suggested the body had been placed in the grave in a flexed or curled position, possibly to fit within the limited space of the basement excavation, and had been wrapped in what appeared to be a dark green wool blanket before burial. Most significantly, Dr. Hollis identified what she described as trauma to the skull, specifically fractures to the left temporal and parietal bones that appeared to be perimortem, meaning they had occurred at or near the time of death. The pattern of fractures suggested blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck by a heavy object or falling and striking the head against a hard surface. While Dr. Hollis cautioned that a full laboratory examination would be necessary to determine the exact cause of death, the skull trauma provided strong evidence that this individual had died from violent injury rather than natural causes or accident. Detective Kovacs stood at the edge of the excavation, watching as the team carefully exposed and documented what almost certainly was Sarah Burkhart's final resting place. She thought about the young woman who had been buried here, whose life had been cut short at just 19 years old, who had spent the past 2 decades in this dark basement while her family searched for answers and her murderer lived above her grave. The cruelty of it was overwhelming, the calculation required to murder someone and then bury them in your own basement, to live your daily life knowing what lay beneath your feet, to maintain that terrible secret for years until death finally ended your participation in the deception. By mid-afternoon, the skeletal remains had been fully exposed and documented, and Dr. Hollis determined they were ready for careful removal and transportation to the county morgue, where a complete examination could be conducted. The remains were lifted carefully, still wrapped in the remnants of the blanket, and placed in a specialized container designed for transporting skeletal remains. Additional soil samples were collected from around and beneath the burial site, as these might contain trace evidence or forensic material that could provide additional information about the burial or the circumstances of death. Once the remains had been removed, the forensic team continued excavating to ensure they had not missed any evidence that might have settled to the bottom of the grave. They found several items of interest, including fragments of what appeared to be denim fabric, possibly from jeans, a zipper that might have been from a jacket or sweatshirt, and most significantly, a small gold necklace with a pendant in the shape of a cross. The jewelry was photographed in place and then carefully collected for evidence, as it might help with identification or might have belonged to Sarah Burkhart and be recognized by her family. Detective Kovacs contacted Robert and Linda Burkhart to inform them that human remains had been discovered at the property where their daughter had lived with her grandparents. She was careful to explain that positive identification would require forensic analysis, including dental records and possibly DNA testing, but that the preliminary findings were consistent with the remains, being those of a young adult female who had died from traumatic injury approximately 2 decades ago. She asked if they could provide information about any identifying characteristics Sarah might have had, including jewelry she typically wore, and whether they could assist in obtaining Sarah's dental records for comparison. Linda Burkhart, through tears, described the gold cross necklace that Sarah had worn constantly, a confirmation gift present from her grandmother Dorothy. The description matched the necklace found in the gravesite, providing strong circumstantial evidence that these were indeed Sarah's remains, even before formal forensic identification could be completed. Robert Burkhart's voice was hollow as he told Kovacs that he had always known, somewhere deep in his heart, that Sarah was dead and that something terrible had happened to her at his parents' property. But knowing and having it confirmed were 2 different things, and now he had to face the reality that his own father had almost certainly killed his daughter, and had hidden her body in such a calculating, cruel manner. The forensic examination of the remains at the county morgue proceeded over the next several days, with Dr. Hollis working in conjunction with forensic odontologists and DNA specialists to confirm identification and determine as much as possible about the circumstances of death. The dental examination provided definitive confirmation that the remains were those of Sarah Burkhart, as the dental patterns matched Sarah's dental records exactly, including several distinctive fillings and the positioning of her wisdom teeth. DNA analysis using a sample from Linda Burkhart confirmed the maternal relationship, providing scientific certainty beyond any doubt. The forensic examination of the skull trauma revealed extensive information about the fatal injury. Sarah had been struck multiple times on the left side of her head with a heavy object, possibly a hammer or similar tool, causing fractures that would have resulted in rapid loss of consciousness and death within minutes. The pattern of injuries suggested that Sarah had been facing away from her attacker when the first blow landed, and that subsequent blows had been struck while she was falling or already on the ground. The nature of the injuries indicated that this was not a case of accidental death or heat-of-the-moment violence, but rather a sustained assault that demonstrated clear intent to kill. Dr. Hollis's report also noted that there was no evidence of other significant trauma to the skeleton, no defensive injuries to the hands or arms that would suggest Sarah had fought with her attacker, and no healing fractures or old injuries that might indicate a history of abuse. The findings suggested that Sarah had been attacked suddenly, possibly from behind, and had not had the opportunity to defend herself before losing consciousness. The attack appeared to have occurred indoors, as there was no evidence of the kind of environmental damage to bones that might occur if a body had been exposed to the elements before burial. With the identification confirmed and cause of death established, Detective Kovacs turned her attention to building a case against Harold Burkhart, despite the fact that he had been dead for 6 years and could never face criminal prosecution. The investigation was no longer about bringing someone to trial, but about establishing the truth of what had happened to Sarah Burkhart, providing her family with answers, and ensuring that the historical record accurately reflected Harold Burkhart's responsibility for his granddaughter's death. Kovacs believed that the community and Sarah's family deserved a complete accounting of the crime, even if the perpetrator had escaped earthly justice by dying before his crimes were discovered. Kovacs began reconstructing the timeline of Sarah's death and burial based on the physical evidence and historical records. Sarah had disappeared on October 23, 2003, last seen leaving the Kent State Regional Campus in mid-afternoon. She had been living with her grandparents and driving back to their property after classes, a routine she followed several days per week. The original investigation had established that Sarah's car had been found in the campus parking lot, suggesting she had never left the campus, but Kovacs now believed this had been misdirection, possibly with the car being moved to the campus after Sarah's death to create a false trail and divert suspicion from the Burkhart property. Kovacs theorized that Sarah had driven home from campus as usual on October 23rd, had arrived at her grandparents' house in the late afternoon, and had been killed shortly thereafter in a confrontation with Harold Burkhart. The motive remained unclear, but Kovacs believed it might be related to whatever Sarah had discovered that had troubled her in the weeks before her death. The friend's statement about Sarah finding something upsetting at her grandparents' house suggested that Sarah might have confronted Harold about whatever she had discovered, and that confrontation had escalated to violence. The investigation into Harold Burkhart's background revealed information that had not been fully explored during the original missing persons investigation. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Harold had been investigated twice on suspicion of domestic violence against his wife Dorothy, though no charges had been filed in either case because Dorothy had declined to cooperate with prosecutors. The incidents had been documented in old police reports that predated computerized records, and they had not been readily accessible to investigators in 2003 when Sarah disappeared. The reports described Harold as having a temper that could turn violent when he felt challenged or disrespected, particularly when he had been drinking. Additionally, Kovacs discovered that Harold Burkhart had been fired from his machining job in '98, 2 years before his official retirement, due to conflicts with supervisors and coworkers. The termination documents described him as becoming increasingly difficult and confrontational in his final years of employment, with several incidents of verbal aggression toward colleagues and at least one physical altercation that had resulted in a suspension. These discoveries painted a picture of a man with a capacity for violence and a need to maintain control, characteristics that were consistent with someone who might kill a family member during a confrontation and then methodically conceal the crime. Kovacs also investigated the logistics of how Harold had managed to conceal Sarah's death and dispose of her body without arousing immediate suspicion. The timeline suggested that Harold had killed Sarah in the late afternoon or evening of October 23rd, then had kept her body concealed somewhere on the property, possibly in the basement or in one of the outbuildings, while he formulated a plan for permanent disposal. He had reported Sarah missing the following day, October 24th, claiming she had not returned home from campus the previous evening. This had given him approximately 18 hours to clean up any evidence of violence in the house and to prepare his story before law enforcement became involved. The concrete work in the basement had been done approximately 3 months later, in January 2004, during the coldest part of winter when the ground outside would have been frozen and difficult to excavate. Kovacs believed that Harold had initially buried Sarah's body in a shallow grave somewhere else on the property, possibly planning to move it to a more permanent location when weather permitted. But when Sarah's car was found at the campus, and the investigation focused on that area rather than the Burkhart property, Harold had apparently decided that the safest plan was to move the body into his own basement, where he could maintain complete control over access and where he could conceal the grave with concrete. The brutally cold logic of this plan was chilling in its effectiveness. By burying Sarah in his basement, Harold had ensured that her body would only be discovered if someone specifically excavated that location, which would only happen if investigators had specific evidence pointing to the basement as a burial site. He had obtained a legitimate building permit for the concrete work, creating official documentation that made the repair appear routine and innocent. And he had lived above his granddaughter's grave for over a decade, maintaining the secret until his death, secure in the knowledge that as long as he controlled access to the property, Sarah's body would never be found. Gordon Maddox's information about the odor complaints in early 2004 took on new significance in light of these findings. Kovacs believed that Harold had moved Sarah's body into the basement sometime in late December 2003 or early January 2004, possibly during the Christmas period when neighbors would be less likely to notice unusual activity. The body would have been partially decomposed by that point, having been buried elsewhere for approximately 2 months, and the process of digging it up and moving it would have released significant odors. Harold's hasty work to pour concrete over the grave had been motivated by the need to contain those odors before they attracted attention from neighbors or prompted additional investigation. The investigation also revealed that Harold had made several suspicious purchases in late 2003 and early 2004 that were consistent with planning and executing a concealed burial. He had bought lime and other materials typically used for managing decomposition odors, heavy plastic sheeting that might have been used to wrap the body during transportation, and specialized concrete mixing equipment that would allow him to pour the basement floor without hiring contractors who might observe or remember the work. These purchases had been made with cash at different stores to avoid creating a traceable pattern, but Kovacs found receipts and witness statements that documented Harold's unusual buying behavior during this period. Deputy Tobias Claiborne assisted Kovacs with interviewing neighbors and former associates of Harold Burkhart, gathering additional information about his behavior in the years after Sarah's disappearance. Multiple people reported that Harold had become increasingly reclusive after his wife Dorothy's death in 2005, rarely leaving his property and avoiding social interactions. Several neighbors mentioned that Harold had been obsessively protective of his property, confronting anyone who came too close to his house and refusing to allow even family members to enter without supervision. One neighbor recalled an incident where Harold had become furious when some children accidentally threw a ball into his yard and had come to retrieve it, screaming at them to stay away from his property and threatening to call police if they ever returned. This territorial behavior, while not proof of murder, was consistent with someone guarding a terrible secret and fearing discovery. Harold's increasing isolation and paranoia in his final years suggested a man living with profound guilt and constant anxiety about being exposed. When his health deteriorated and he was forced to move to a nursing home in 2017, he had insisted on hiring a property management company to maintain the house rather than allowing family members to care for it, apparently concerned that family members might discover evidence he had missed or might question the basement concrete work. The investigation also examined Dorothy Burkhart's potential knowledge of or involvement in Sarah's death and burial. The evidence suggested that Dorothy had probably known or strongly suspected that Harold had killed Sarah, but had either actively assisted in the cover-up or had remained silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty. Friends recalled that Dorothy had been deeply affected by Sarah's disappearance, becoming depressed and withdrawn, but that she had never wavered in supporting Harold's account of events. Some friends had sensed that Dorothy was keeping secrets, that she knew more than she was saying, but she had died without ever revealing what she knew. Detective Kovacs found this aspect of the case particularly troubling, the possibility that Dorothy Burkhart had chosen to protect her husband rather than seeking justice for her granddaughter. But Kovacs also recognized that Dorothy might have been a victim herself, possibly abused or intimidated by Harold into silence, living with terrible knowledge and unable to act on it. The records of past domestic violence investigations suggested that Dorothy had experienced Harold's violence firsthand and might have been afraid of what he would do if she revealed his crime. The truth about Dorothy's knowledge and involvement would never be fully known, as she had taken her secrets to the grave. With the forensic examination complete and the investigative findings documented, Kovacs prepared a comprehensive report on the Sarah Burkhart homicide for presentation to the Holmes County prosecutor and to Sarah's family. The report concluded that Sarah Burkhart had been murdered by her grandfather, Harold Burkhart, on or about October 23, 2003, that her body had been concealed on the property and later buried in the basement beneath concrete flooring, and that Harold had maintained this deception until his death in 2018. While Harold could never face criminal prosecution, the report would formally close the case and provide official acknowledgement of what had happened to Sarah. The public release of the investigation findings generated significant media attention and community reaction throughout Holmes County and beyond. Many people who had known the Burkhart family expressed shock and disbelief that Harold could have committed such a crime, while others said they had always sensed something wrong about how he behaved after Sarah's disappearance. The case sparked conversations about domestic violence, family secrets, and the ways that seemingly ordinary people could conceal terrible crimes for decades. Several community members came forward with their own stories of Harold's temper and controlling behavior, pieces of a pattern that had been visible in retrospect but had not been recognized as warning signs at the time. For Robert and Linda Burkhart, the confirmation that their daughter had been murdered by Robert's own father was devastating in ways that went beyond the grief of losing Sarah. The betrayal was almost incomprehensible. The realization that the man who had raised Robert, who had appeared to be a devoted grandfather to Sarah, had killed her and had allowed his own son to suffer for 2 decades, not knowing what had happened. Robert publicly stated that while he was grateful for the investigative work that had finally brought the truth to light, he would never understand how his father could have done something so evil and then maintained the deception so completely. The Burkhart family arranged for Sarah's remains to be cremated and interred in the family cemetery plot, finally bringing her home properly after 2 decades in an unmarked grave beneath her grandparents' basement. A memorial service was held in Millersburg, attended by hundreds of people including former classmates, teachers, and community members who remembered Sarah and had followed her case over the years. Detective Kovacs and Deputy Claiborne attended the service, and Linda Burkhart sought them out afterward to thank them for their work in finally giving Sarah justice and allowing the family to properly grieve and honor her memory. Eunice Perrin faced difficult decisions about whether to continue living in a house that had been the site of such terrible secrets. She ultimately decided to sell the property, unable to feel comfortable living above the space where Sarah had been buried for so many years. The disclosure of the home's history made it difficult to sell, but eventually a buyer who was aware of the complete story purchased the property with plans to renovate extensively and create new memories that would overshadow the dark past. The basement concrete was completely removed and replaced, symbolically erasing the physical reminder of what had been hidden there. Deputy Claiborne reflected on how a routine 911 call about sounds in a basement had led to solving one of the county's most haunting mysteries. His decision to thoroughly investigate Eunice Perrin's concerns, rather than dismissing them as the imaginings of an anxious elderly woman, had been vindicated by the discovery of Sarah's remains and the resolution of a 20-year-old case. The investigation reinforced Claiborne's belief in the importance of taking every call seriously and following evidence wherever it led, no matter how unlikely the conclusions might initially seem. Gordon Maddox, who had dispatched the original call and had provided crucial historical information about the case, continued his work at the Emergency Communications Center with renewed appreciation for the importance of institutional memory and comprehensive record-keeping. His recollection of details from 2003 and his willingness to dig through old records had been instrumental in connecting Deputy Claiborne's observations to the broader context of the Sarah Burkhart disappearance. The case demonstrated how experienced dispatchers could be invaluable resources in investigations, possessing knowledge and context that might not be immediately apparent in written reports or computerized databases. For Detective Kovacs, the Sarah Burkhart case became one of the most significant investigations of her career, demonstrating the value of persistence, thorough evidence analysis, and willingness to re-examine cold cases when new information emerged. She frequently used the case in training presentations, emphasizing how modern investigative techniques like ground-penetrating radar could be combined with traditional detective work to solve historical crimes. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining and preserving historical records, as details documented decades earlier had proven crucial to understanding what had happened and why. The months following the discovery of Sarah Burkhart's remains brought profound changes to Holmes County and to everyone whose lives had been touched by the investigation. Detective Maria Kovacs found herself increasingly focused on cold cases, recognizing that the Sarah Burkhart investigation had demonstrated how modern forensic techniques and persistent detective work could bring resolution to families who had spent years or decades without answers. She established a cold case review unit within the Holmes County Sheriff's Office, dedicating resources specifically to re-examining unsolved disappearances and suspicious deaths that had occurred in the county over the past several decades. Deputy Tobias Claiborne continued working patrol in rural Holmes County, but the Sarah Burkhart case had fundamentally changed how he approached his duties. He paid closer attention to calls involving elderly residents, isolated properties, and reports of suspicious activity that might seem minor on the surface but could indicate more serious problems. The case had taught him that routine calls could lead to extraordinary outcomes, and he trained newer deputies to trust their instincts when something seemed wrong, even if they could not immediately articulate what bothered them about a situation. Gordon Maddox, the dispatcher who had taken Eunice Perrin's original 911 call and who had provided crucial historical information about the Burkhart family, became an advocate for better documentation and information sharing within the emergency communications system. He worked with Detective Kovacs to develop protocols for flagging properties and individuals with significant criminal histories, ensuring that responding officers would have access to relevant background information when they were dispatched to calls. The relationship between Maddox and the investigative division became much closer following the case, with detectives recognizing that dispatchers often possessed valuable information and perspective that could aid investigations. Eunice Perrin struggled significantly in the aftermath of discovering that her home had been the burial site for a murdered young woman. Even after selling the property and moving to a condominium in Millersburg, Perrin experienced nightmares and anxiety related to the years she had lived unknowingly above Sarah's grave. She sought counseling to process the trauma and eventually found some peace by focusing on the positive outcome. Perrin maintained contact with Linda Burkhart, Sarah's mother, and the two women formed an unlikely friendship based on their shared experience with the case. Perrin attended the memorial service for Sarah and contributed to a scholarship fund that the Burkhart family established in Sarah's memory. The community response to the Sarah Burkhart case was complex and multifaceted. Many residents of Holmes County had known the Burkhart family for generations and struggled to reconcile their memories of Harold as a neighbor or acquaintance with the reality of what he had done to his granddaughter. The case sparked difficult conversations about how seemingly ordinary people could conceal monstrous behaviors, and about the warning signs that communities often missed or dismissed. Several community organizations hosted forums on domestic violence, family dynamics, and the importance of speaking up when something seemed wrong rather than maintaining silence to avoid conflict. The case also influenced how law enforcement agencies throughout Ohio approached missing persons investigations, particularly those involving young adults who might be assumed to have left voluntarily. The Ohio Attorney General's office incorporated the case into their training materials for law enforcement officers, using it to illustrate the importance of questioning assumptions and following evidence, even when it pointed toward uncomfortable conclusions. Detective Kovacs was invited to present the case at a national conference on cold case investigations, where her presentation generated significant interest from detectives and forensic specialists across the country. Robert and Linda Burkhart eventually established the Sarah Burkhart Foundation, dedicated to supporting missing persons investigations and providing resources to families dealing with the disappearance of loved ones. The foundation funded training for law enforcement officers in advanced investigative techniques, provided grants for forensic testing in cold cases, and offered counseling services for families struggling with the uncertainty and trauma of having a missing loved one. Working with state legislators, they helped pass several reforms, including mandatory protocols for investigating missing persons cases involving young adults and requirements for maintaining comprehensive databases across jurisdictions. These changes, collectively known as Sarah's Law, represented a meaningful legacy for a young woman whose life had been cut tragically short. 5 years after the discovery of Sarah's remains, a memorial marker was placed in downtown Millersburg, in a small park that had been Sarah's favorite place to walk during her high school years. The marker honored Sarah's memory and served as a reminder to the community about the importance of speaking up when something seemed wrong and supporting law enforcement efforts to solve cold cases. The dedication ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including Sarah's family, the investigators who had worked her case, and community members who wanted to ensure that Sarah would be remembered not just as a victim, but as a person who had been loved and whose loss had changed her community. Detective Kovacs, speaking at the dedication ceremony, reflected on what the Sarah Burkhart case had taught her about the nature of evil and the importance of persistence in seeking justice. She noted that Harold Burkhart had not been a monster in the typical sense, but rather an ordinary man who had made a terrible choice and had then committed himself to concealing that choice regardless of the cost to others. But the case also demonstrated the power of the justice system when it worked as intended, when law enforcement officers took their responsibilities seriously, when forensic specialists applied their expertise with care and precision, and when communities supported efforts to uncover truth even when that truth was painful. Sergeant Claiborne, now promoted and supervising a team of rural patrol deputies, continued to drive past the former Burkhart property on Township Road 362 during his shifts. The property had been extensively renovated by its new owners, and there were no obvious reminders of the terrible secrets it had once held. But Claiborne never forgot that cold November night when he had responded to Eunice Perrin's call about sounds in her basement. Never forgot the moment when he had first noticed the newer concrete section and had felt his instincts telling him that something was wrong. That moment had set in motion a chain of events that brought justice for Sarah Burkhart and closure for her family. Gordon Maddox, approaching retirement after more than 30 years in emergency communications, often reflected on the role that seemingly minor details and careful documentation had played in solving Sarah's case. The information he had remembered about the 2003 missing persons investigation and Harold Burkhart's behavior patterns over the years had all contributed to the investigative mosaic that ultimately revealed the truth. Maddox emphasized to younger dispatchers that their work was not simply about taking calls and sending units, but about being part of a larger system of justice and community protection, where every piece of information could prove crucial. As the years passed, and the immediate intensity of the Sarah Burkhart investigation faded into history, the case remained a touchstone for everyone involved, a reminder of why their work mattered, and what could be accomplished through dedication, skill, and refusing to accept that some mysteries were simply unsolvable. The case demonstrated that truth could remain buried for decades, but could still be uncovered if people cared enough to look for it, that justice could be delayed but need not be permanently denied, and that even when the perpetrator escaped earthly accountability, establishing the historical record and providing closure to families served important purposes. For the Burkhart family, the pain of Sarah's loss never fully healed, but the resolution of her case allowed them to move forward with their lives in ways that had not been possible during the years of uncertainty. They knew where Sarah was. They understood what had happened to her, and they could honor her memory without the constant torment of wondering whether she might still be alive somewhere, waiting to be found. Linda Burkhart often shared at support groups that while learning the truth about Sarah's death had been devastating, the not knowing had been worse. The years of uncertainty had been a unique form of torture that only ended when Detective Kovacs called to tell them that Sarah's remains had been found. 10 years after Eunice Perrin's 911 call about sounds in her basement, the Sarah Burkhart case had become part of the institutional memory of the Holmes County Sheriff's Office, a story that was passed down to new generations of deputies and investigators as an example of exemplary police work and community service. The message was clear. Justice might be delayed, but it should never be abandoned, and every victim deserved the best efforts of law enforcement regardless of how much time had passed or how cold the trail had become. The Holmes County community gradually absorbed the lessons of the Sarah Burkhart case, recognizing that appearances could be deceiving, that respectability and family connections did not preclude criminal behavior, and that speaking up when something seemed wrong was a civic duty that could save lives or bring justice to victims. The property on Township Road 362 eventually lost its association with tragedy as new owners created new memories, and the physical structure was substantially renovated. But those who had been involved in the investigation never forgot what that property had represented, the secrets it had held, and the justice that had finally emerged from its dark basement. The November rains continued to fall each year across Holmes County, washing across the farmland and forests, soaking into the ground where countless secrets lay buried beneath the peaceful rural landscape. But Sarah Burkhart's secret had been unearthed, her story had been told, and her memory had been honored. The investigation that began with a single 911 call about suspicious sounds had brought light into darkness, had given a family the closure they desperately needed, and had demonstrated that justice, while sometimes delayed, could ultimately prevail when good people refused to give up on finding the truth.